A special thank you to David Graham and Amber Betters for their support in bringing this story to light. They found the first body face down in the snow, barefoot, wearing only underwear. The thermometer that morning read -38 degrees Fahrenheit. No human being removes their clothes in cold like that unless something has broken their mind completely. What the search team discovered next would haunt Soviet records for decades, and what they were ordered to never speak of would become the most terrifying cover-up of the 20th century. This is the story of 9 experienced hikers who walked into the Ural Mountains in February 1959 and encountered something that was never supposed to exist. Igor Dyatlov checked his compass one final time before shouldering his pack, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the January air. The 23-year-old engineering student from Ural Polytechnic Institute had planned this expedition with military precision, every detail accounted for, every contingency mapped. His fingers, already numbing despite wool gloves, traced the route on the laminated map one more time. "You worry too much, Igor," Rustem Slobodin said, grinning as he adjusted his own pack. At 23, Rustem was Igor's closest friend, the kind of companion who could diffuse tension with a joke even in the harshest conditions. "We've done harder treks than this. Remember the subpolar Urals last winter?" Igor smiled despite himself. "Remember? I still have frostbite scars from that disaster you called a shortcut. That shortcut saved us 6 hours. It nearly cost us 3 toes. The banter was comfortable, familiar. They'd been hiking together since their first year at the Polytechnic. Igor trusted Rustem's instincts in the wilderness almost as much as he trusted his own calculations. The date was January 27th, 1959. The group consisted of 7 men and 2 women, ranging in age from 21 to 37. Besides Igor and Rustem, there was Yuri Yudin, a geology student with a sharp wit and sharper eyes for terrain. Zinaida Kolmogorova, who insisted everyone call her Zina, was a 5th-year student with more mountain experience than most of the men. Alexander Kolevatov, quiet and methodical, was the group's de facto equipment specialist. Nicolas Thibault Brignol, whose French surname prompted endless jokes, was the strongest climber among them. The 2 other Yuris, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, were both engineers and both incurable optimists. Ludmila Dubinina, called Luda by everyone, was the group's photographer and unofficial chronicler, and Semyon Zolotaryov, the eldest at 37, carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd seen the Urals in every season. Every single one held advanced hiking certifications. Between them, they had over 100 expeditions completed. This was not a group of amateurs stumbling into the wilderness. Zina approached Igor as the group finished their final preparations in Vizhai, the last settlement before true wilderness began. Her dark eyes studied his face with the kind of perception that always made him slightly uncomfortable. "You're thinking about the weather reports," she said. Not a question. Igor nodded. Temperature drops to -40 predicted. High winds, limited visibility. Standard winter conditions for the northern Urals, Zina said, echoing his own assessment. "We've handled worse." "I know." Igor folded the map, tucking it into his jacket's inner pocket. "But something feels different this time. The meteorologist in Ivdel seemed, I don't know, concerned. Old Mikhail is always concerned. He thinks anyone who hikes in winter is suicidal." Zina placed a hand on Igor's shoulder. "We're prepared. We have the best gear, the best team, and the best route planner." She squeezed once, firmly. "Trust your preparation." Igor wanted to believe her. The route was sound. North from Vizhai, through the Auspia Valley, then over the mountain pass toward Otorten. They'd filed their expedition plan with the university, arranged for radio check-ins every 72 hours, and packed emergency supplies sufficient for 3 weeks if necessary. Their planned route would take them north from the town of Vizhai, through the Auspia Valley, then over the mountain pass toward Otorten, a name that translated roughly from the local Mansi language as "don't go there." Before they departed, an old Mansi man approached their group. His face was weathered like ancient leather, his eyes the colour of winter sky. He spoke Russian with a thick accent, his words slow and deliberate. "You go to your Torten," he said. "Not a question." Igor nodded. "Yes, grandfather. Do you know the route?" "I know the mountain." The old man's gaze moved across each member of the group, lingering on faces as if memorizing them. "In Mansi we call it different name. Kholat Shachel, Mountain of the Dead." Rustem laughed nervously. "Cheerful. Any other warnings? Curses? Ancient prophecies?" The old man didn't smile. "The mountain sleeps most times. Sometimes it wakes. When it wakes, the air becomes heavy. Sound carries strange. Animals leave." He looked directly at Igor. "If you feel the mountain wake, you leave. Immediately. Do not stay to understand. Do not try to reason. Leave." "What wakes it?" Zena asked, her voice respectful. "Many things. The wind, when it blows from the north in certain patterns. The earth, when pressure builds beneath the stone. Sometimes..." He paused, choosing words carefully. "Sometimes things that are not of the mountain. Things that call to it." Semyon, who'd been listening quietly, stepped forward. At 37, he was old enough to have fought in the Great Patriotic War, and his face carried scars that suggested he'd seen action. "Grandfather, I've climbed mountains from the Caucasus to the Pamirs. Every range has its spirits and stories. We respect them, but we're experienced hikers. We know how to survive." The old man studied Semyon with particular intensity. "You have soldier's eyes. You have seen death." It wasn't a question. "But you have not seen this death. This death comes from inside and outside at the same time. This death has no mercy because it has no intention. It simply is." An uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Even Rustem had stopped smiling. Finally Igor spoke. "Thank you for the warning, grandfather. We'll be careful." The old man nodded slowly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, pressing it into Igor's hand, offering, "If you must camp on the mountain, leave this at the edge of your camp. It may do nothing, but it may remind the mountain you mean no harm." Igor felt the pouch, something dried and fragrant inside. Herbs, perhaps. "Thank you." "Do not thank me," the old man said. "Just remember, when the mountain sings, run." That had been 4 days ago. The group had made good progress initially, but weather had slowed them. A storm on January 30th forced them to camp for an extra day. By February 1st, they were behind schedule but still confident. The terrain was challenging but manageable. Spirits remained high. Igor's diary from that morning, later recovered from the tent, showed routine observations. February 1st, morning. Temperature approximately -30. Wind picking up from the northwest. Will attempt to cross the ridge today and make camp on the eastern slope. Weather deteriorating, but group is strong. Zena made a joke about Rustem's snoring keeping bears away. Everyone in good spirits. They began their ascent of Kholat Shachel around noon. The slope was steep, but not technically difficult. A grinding climb that tested endurance more than skill. Snow came up to their knees in places, and the wind intensified as they gained elevation. Lyuda stopped periodically to photograph the landscape, her camera clicking despite the cold. "This light is incredible," she called to Igor, who'd paused to wait for her. "The way the sun hits the snow, it's almost otherworldly." Igor looked at the vista. She was right. The low winter sun created long shadows across the slope, and ice crystals in the air produced rainbow halos, beautiful and desolate in equal measure. "Make it quick," he called back. "We need to set up camp before dark." By late afternoon, they'd crossed the ridge and were traversing along the eastern slope. The wind was brutal here, coming in gusts that threatened to knock them off their feet. Igor made the decision to stop earlier than planned, around 5 p.m, while they still had daylight to work with. "Here," he announced, pointing to a relatively flat section of slope. It wasn't ideal. They were still somewhat exposed and the snow was deep, but darkness was coming and they needed shelter. "Not below the tree line?" Nicholas asked, having to shout over the wind. "Too far. We camp here, digging good, ride out the wind tonight. We'll make better time tomorrow once this blows through." The group set to work with practiced efficiency. They dug out a platform in the snow, pitched the military-grade canvas tent, secured it with skis and poles as additional anchors. Inside, they arranged their sleeping bags, set up the portable stove, and began preparing the evening meal. The tent was cramped with 9 people inside, but the body heat was welcome. As the stove warmed their small space, the mood lightened. Rustem told a rambling story about his last expedition that had everyone laughing. Alexander was quietly darning a torn glove. Luda wrote in her journal by flashlight. Zina and Igor reviewed the next day's route. "We're maybe 1,600 metres below the summit," Igor said, tracing the topographic lines on his map. "If weather cooperates, we can make Ototin by tomorrow evening." "And if it doesn't cooperate?" Zina asked. "Then we wait it out." Igor glanced around the tent at his companions, his friends. They'd been through rough conditions before. They were equipped. They were experienced. They would be fine. At approximately 6 Dila p.m., Igor made his final diary entry. "We set up the tent on the slope. Wind is fierce, but tent is secure. Everyone is well. We'll attempt to reach..." The entry ended mid-sentence. What happened next can only be reconstructed from physical evidence, because no one survived to tell the story. Mikhail Sharavin's hands were shaking, and not from the cold. The young search volunteer stood 50 metres from the orange canvas tent, unable to make himself move closer. He'd been part of search and rescue operations before, missing hikers, lost hunters, the occasional foolish tourist. He'd found bodies. He'd seen what the mountains could do to human beings when they made mistakes. This was different. Mikhail. The call came from behind him. Yuri Koptilov, another volunteer who'd arrived with the ground team. "What did you find?" Sharavin couldn't answer. His throat had closed around words that refused to form. He simply pointed. Koptilov came forward, his boots crunching through the crusty snow. He stopped beside Sharavan and went completely silent. The tent was half collapsed, its canvas torn and flapping in the wind like wounded flesh. Snow had drifted against one side, partially burying it. But that wasn't what had frozen both men in place. The tent had been cut, not torn by wind, not ripped by falling ice, deliberately slashed open from the inside with a blade. Multiple cuts, ragged exits through which the occupants had clearly fled, and scattered around the collapsed structure, partially visible in the snow, were items no fleeing hikers would leave behind. Boots, jackets, warm clothing. "Radio base camp," Koptilov finally managed. "Tell them we found something." The date was February 26, 1959, 25 days after the Dyatlov group had last been heard from. By afternoon, lead investigator Lev Ivanov had reached the site with a larger team. At 52, Ivanov had led. Ivanov, search and rescue operations for 12 years across the Urals and Siberia. He'd seen avalanche victims, exposure deaths, bear attacks, falls from cliffs. He'd investigated murders disguised as accidents, and accidents that looked like murders. He thought he'd witnessed every way the mountains could kill. Approaching the tent, he realised he'd been wrong. "Photograph everything before anyone touches anything," he ordered. "I want documentation of every detail exactly as we find it." The photographer, a young man named Genrikov, began his work while Ivanov circled the site slowly, his experienced eyes cataloguing details. The tent was military-grade canvas, designed to withstand the worst the Urals could deliver. It was secured with skis and poles in the standard manner. The positioning showed the occupants had known what they were doing. They'd chosen a reasonably sheltered location, dug a proper platform, anchored everything correctly. But from inside the tent, someone had taken a knife and cut at least 3 large slashes through the canvas. The cuts were frantic, desperate, made with enough force to slice through the heavy fabric in single strokes. "Sir?" One of the search team members, Mikhail Libin, stood near the tent entrance. His face was pale. "You need to see inside." Ivanov carefully opened the tent flap and looked within. The interior was a frozen still life of interrupted routine. 9 sleeping bags were arranged in 2 rows, some still partially unrolled as if their occupants had been preparing to sleep. A portable stove sat cold but intact, positioned exactly where it should be. Food was laid out: dried meat, bread, condensed milk, portions prepared but uneaten. There were flashlights, still functional, extra clothing, neatly stacked, boots lined up in pairs, everything a group would need to survive in extreme cold, all of it left behind. On the tent floor near one of the slashes, Ivanov found a knife still open, its blade crusted with frozen fabric fibres. Not dropped in panic, but placed down deliberately after cutting the final exit. They didn't flee in blind panic, Ivanov said quietly, more to himself than to Libin. This was organised. They cut their way out systematically, multiple exits so everyone could get out quickly. But why? What could make experienced hikers abandon their shelter like this? Avalanche, Libin suggested. Ivanov looked at the slope above them. The angle was wrong, too gentle to produce a significant avalanche. The snowpack showed no signs of recent movement or settling. And crucially, if an avalanche had been coming, they would have fled out the tent entrance, not waste precious seconds cutting new holes. Not avalanche, Ivanov said. Something else. The search team carefully excavated the tent and documented its contents. Then they turned their attention to the footprints. 9 distinct sets of tracks led away from the tent down the slope toward the tree line, approximately 1,000 metres below. The prints were extraordinarily clear, preserved by the freezing conditions. What they revealed was deeply unsettling. The track showed that at least 6 of the hikers had been barefoot or wearing only socks. 2 appeared to have single boots, 1 left, 1 right. 1 person had been completely barefoot. But the gait patterns, those were what made Ivanov's blood run cold. These weren't the stumbling, erratic prints of people fleeing in terror. The footprints showed purpose, even spacing, normal stride length. In a few places, the tracks indicated someone had stopped and turned back briefly toward the tent before continuing downward. They'd left in an organised manner, walking calmly through snow in negative 30-degree temperatures without proper clothing. It's like they were sleepwalking, Genrikov said, studying one particularly clear set of prints, or under some kind of trance. Ivanov didn't respond. He was thinking about his own experience with exposure victims. Severe hypothermia caused confusion, disorientation, eventually hallucinations. But this group had just left a warm tent. They couldn't have been hypothermic yet. So why walk calmly to their deaths? Follow the tracks, he ordered. Carefully, document everything. The search team moved down slope in a line, following the footprints toward the tree line. The slope was steep here, and the wind had been fierce on the night of February 1st. Ivanov could see the patterns of wind-sculpted snow, drifts that showed the direction and intensity of the storm. The 9 sets of prints stayed remarkably close together, never spreading more than a few metres apart. Whatever they were walking toward or fleeing from, they stayed as a group. The forest began about 700 metres below the tent. Dark pine trees, stunted by altitude and harsh conditions, marked the boundary where the open slope gave way to scrub woodland. Just inside the tree line, beneath a large cedar tree, they found the first bodies. Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko were lying within metres of each other, both wearing only underwear, both shoeless. Their skin was the waxy grey-blue of advanced hypothermia. Around them, the snow was disturbed, showing signs of significant activity. But it was the cedar tree that drew Ivanov's attention. The tree's lower branches, up to a height of nearly 5 metres, had been broken off. Not cut or sawed, but snapped off forcibly. The broken ends showed fresh wood, white and splintered. On the trunk, Ivanov could see marks where bark had been scraped away, as if someone had climbed frantically. They were trying to see something, he said. They climbed this tree to get a higher vantage point. To see what? Genrikov asked. Either to see back toward the tent, or... Ivanov paused, turning slowly to look at the forest around them. The trees were dense enough here to provide shelter from wind, sparse enough to see between them, or to see what was coming through. The forest! Both bodies showed burns on their hands and feet. Nearby they found the remains of a small fire, just embers and charred wood, but evidence that the group had attempted to create warmth. They tried to start a fire, Pippin said. But why here? Why not in the tent? Because they couldn't go back to the tent, Ivanov said quietly. The realization was settling over him like ice water. Something was keeping them from going back. The search expanded outward from the cedar tree. Within an hour, they found 3 more bodies scattered at intervals up the slope, positioned as if they'd been attempting to return to the tent. Zinaida Kolmogorova was discovered 330 metres upslope from the cedar tree. She was frozen in a position that suggested she'd fallen forward while climbing. Her clothing was minimal: a thin shirt, light pants. Her hands were clenched into fists. Igor Dyatlov was found another 180 metres further up, closer to the tent. He was on his back, one arm raised as if shielding his face from something. He wore slightly more clothing than Zina, a sleeveless shirt, torn pants. His expression, frozen in death, was one of intense concentration. Rustem Slobodin was the highest of the 3, approximately 480 metres from the cedar tree. He was face down in the snow, fully extended. He'd gotten within 300 metres of the tent before collapsing. All 3 showed clear signs of hypothermia, but their positioning revealed something that haunted Ivanov for the rest of his life. They'd been trying to go back. Whatever had driven them from the tent, at some point 3 of them had decided to return. They'd left the relative shelter of the forest and the warmth of the fire to climb back up an exposed slope in lethal cold. And they died trying. That's 8, Genrikov said, reviewing his documentation. The group was 9. Where's the last person? And where's Yuri Yudin? Another searcher asked. Ivanov checked his list. Yuri Yudin had actually left the expedition on January 28th, due to health problems. He'd turned back before the group entered the deep wilderness, a lucky decision that had saved his life. 9 in the final group, Ivanov confirmed. We have 5 bodies accounted for, 4 missing. The search continued as daylight faded. They expanded their pattern, searching further into the forest, checking ravines and rock formations. Night fell with no additional discoveries. Ivanov made the decision to establish a base camp and continue at first light. That night, in the tent they'd erected near the cedar tree, he reviewed his notes by lantern light. 5 bodies, all showing severe hypothermia, some with burns from the fire attempt. No signs of violence from other people. No animal tracks except for some indistinct marks near the cedar tree that might have been fox or small predators. But none of it explained the fundamental impossibility. Why experienced hikers would flee a secure shelter into lethal cold without stopping to dress properly. The case file sat open on Ivanov's lap. He picked up his pen and began writing his initial report. He got as far as preliminary assessment indicates before stopping. What did it indicate? Death by exposure, yes. But the cause of the exposure, the reason for their flight? He closed the file. The wind outside made a low sound as it moved through the trees, almost musical, almost like singing. Ivanov tried not to think about what the old Mansi hunters had told him when the search team first came through this region. They'd said the mountain sometimes sang. When it did, death followed. He tried not to think about the fact that the 5 bodies they'd found all had expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. He tried not to think about why 3 of them had tried to return to the tent despite knowing they would die in the attempt. Most of all, he tried not to think about where the 4 missing hikers might be, or what condition they'd be in when they were found. The wind sang through the trees. Ivanov didn't sleep that night. The spring thaw came slowly to the Urals. Snow that had fallen in January wouldn't fully melt until May, and in the shadow of the mountains, ice could persist until June. The search team knew the remaining 4 bodies were out there somewhere, but finding them would have to wait for better conditions. Lev Ivanov returned to the site in early May with a full forensic team. The forest looked different without its snow blanket, rawer, more exposed. The cedar tree where they had found the first 2 bodies stood like a sentinel, its broken branches pointing accusingly at the sky. Start with a grid pattern radiating out from the cedar tree, Ivanov instructed his team. They were trying to shelter in the forest. If the others didn't try to return upslope, They probably went deeper into the trees looking for better protection. The search began at dawn on May 4th. By noon they'd found the ravine. It was approximately 75 metres into the forest from the cedar tree. A natural depression in the terrain that had filled with snow during the winter. Now, as the snow melted, it revealed what it had hidden. "Over here!" The shout came from one of the searchers, a young geologist named Ashkenazi. He was standing at the edge of the ravine, looking down into the exposed snow with an expression of shock. Ivanov scrambled down to join him, and immediately understood the young man's reaction. At the bottom of the ravine, partially exposed by melting snow, were 4 bodies arranged in a way that suggested they'd been sheltering together. They were lying close to each other, some overlapping, in what had clearly been a deliberate formation to preserve warmth. But the formation hadn't saved them. "Get the photographer down here," Ivanov ordered, "and someone get me a shovel. We need to excavate carefully." Over the next 6 hours, the team carefully removed the snow around the bodies. What they uncovered would generate more questions than answers. The 4 victims were Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nicholas Thibault Brignol. Unlike the first 5 bodies, which had been relatively well preserved by the freezing temperatures, these 4 showed significant decomposition in specific areas. The positioning was strange. They appeared to have arranged themselves into a kind of nest or shelter, using their bodies to create a shared space. The snow had collapsed around them, eventually burying them under 4 meters of accumulation, but it was their clothing that first caught Ivanov's attention. Lyudmila was wearing Yuri Krivonishenko's pants. They were several sizes too large, but they were warmer than what she'd been wearing when they fled the tent. Semyon wore a torn section of Yuri Doroshenko's jacket. The others had similar borrowed items. "They took clothing from the first 2 who died," Genrikov observed, photographing the arrangement. They went back to the cedar tree, took what they could from Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, then came here to try and survive. Ivanov nodded slowly. That made sense. It was a rational survival decision. The dead no longer needed warmth, and the living desperately did. But it also meant these 4 had survived longer than the others. They'd watched their friends die, made the pragmatic decision to scavenge clothing, and then tried to establish a shelter. What finally killed them? The answer came during the autopsy. Vozrojdeny Central Hospital in Ivdel had limited facilities for forensic pathology, but they had enough for basic examinations. The pathologist, Boris Vozrojdeny, was a careful man with 30 years of experience. He'd performed autopsies on victims of industrial accidents, violence, and natural causes. When Ivanov entered the examination room on May 9th to review Vozrojdeny's findings, the pathologist looked like he'd aged a decade. "I don't know how to explain this," Vozrojdeny said without preamble. He led Ivanov to the examination table where Lyudmila Dubinina's body lay covered by a sheet. "What I'm about to show you contradicts normal injury patterns." He pulled back the sheet. Ivanov had seen bodies damaged by falls, by crushing injuries, by violent impacts. What he saw now was different. Lyudmila's chest cavity was severely damaged, multiple ribs fractured and bent inward, her heart compressed, her lungs hemorrhaged. The force required to produce these injuries would be comparable to a high-speed automobile collision or a fall from significant height. But her skin was intact. No bruising, no external impact marks, no abrasions. "Her tongue is also missing," Vozrojdeny said quietly, along with her eyes and part of her facial tissue. But these weren't removed post-mortem by scavengers. The tissue damage suggests removal perimortem, at or very near the time of death. Could she have bitten through her own tongue? Some kind of seizure, or... The tongue was removed from the root, cleanly, almost surgically. Vozrojdeny moved to another examination table. Semyon Zolotaryov has similar chest trauma. Multiple fractured ribs, massive internal damage but minimal external injury, also missing facial tissue, eyes, and part of the mouth. Alexander Kolevatov? Missing eyes. Otherwise, primary cause of death appears to be hypothermia, with some head trauma. And Nicholas Thibault Brignol? Extensive skull fracture. But here's what disturbs me most. Vozrojdeny pulled out his examination notes, flipping through pages covered in dense handwriting. The force vectors are wrong. When someone is struck by a falling object or impacts the ground, we see specific patterns: point of impact, force dispersion, associated surface damage. These injuries don't match that pattern. What pattern do they match? Uniform pressure applied from all directions simultaneously, as if they were crushed by atmospheric pressure rather than mechanical impact. Vozrojdeny looked at Ivanov directly. I've never seen injuries like this outside of underwater diving accidents where someone experiences rapid pressure changes. But these people were on a mountain, not in water. Ivanov felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morgue's temperature. Could it be some kind of explosion? A pressure wave? An explosion would leave burns, blast patterns, particulate damage. There's none of that. Vozrojdeny hesitated, then continued. I'll write my report according to medical standards. I'll document the injuries as I found them. But off the record, something crushed these people from the inside out, and I have no natural explanation for how that could happen. Ivanov left the hospital and walked back to his temporary office in Ivdel's administrative building. His investigation file was growing thicker, but instead of providing answers, each new piece of evidence generated more impossibilities. 9 experienced hikers flee their tent in lethal cold. 5 die of hypothermia while trying to either shelter or return to the tent. 4 survive longer, scavenge clothing from their dead friends, establish a shelter in a ravine, but ultimately die from massive internal trauma that has no clear external cause. And then there was the detail that his superiors had ordered him not to include in his official report. Ivanov pulled out a separate file folder marked Supplementary Testing. Inside were radiation analysis reports from the Sverdlovsk laboratory. Random samples of the victims' clothing had been tested for radioactive contamination. Most samples showed normal background levels, but specific items, particularly those that had been shared between victims, showed elevated readings. Not extreme levels, not immediately dangerous, but definitely above background, and the isotope signatures were consistent with weapons-grade material, not natural sources or medical equipment. Where had it come from? Ivanov had quietly inquired about military testing in the region. The northern Urals had several sensitive installations: missile testing, atmospheric research, nuclear materials transport routes. But all the facilities he'd contacted denied any operations in the immediate area of Kholat Shakhl during late January or early February. The denials came too quickly, too emphatically. Someone was lying. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant entered carrying a message folder. "Sir, this just came from Regional Command, marked urgent." Ivanov opened the folder and read the brief message inside. His hands clenched involuntarily. Effective immediately. The Dyatlov investigation is to be concluded. Cause of death: compelling natural force. No evidence of criminal activity. Case closed. All documentation to be classified and sealed. Further inquiry is neither necessary nor authorized. The message was signed by someone Ivanov didn't recognize, a name followed by credentials indicating KGB involvement. He sat at his desk for a long time, staring at the order. Everything in him resisted this conclusion. He was an investigator. His job was to find the truth, to provide answers to the families who'd lost children and friends. But he was also a pragmatist. He recognized a direct order when he saw one, and he understood that continuing to push would endanger not just his career, but potentially his freedom. That night, Ivanov wrote 2 reports. The first was his official conclusion, carefully worded to satisfy his orders while remaining technically accurate. The investigation finds no evidence of criminal activity. The cause of death was a compelling natural force, which the hikers were unable to overcome. Based on available evidence, the case is closed. The second report he wrote in his private journal, the one he kept hidden in his apartment in Sverdlovsk, May 28, 1959. I have been ordered to close the Dyatlov case without determining the actual cause of death. The order comes from security services whose involvement indicates this incident touches on classified matters. What I know but cannot officially state 9 experienced hikers fled their secure shelter in lethal conditions for unknown reasons. Their behaviour suggests organised decision-making despite the suicidal nature of their actions. They abandoned essential survival gear but left in formation. They did not appear to be fleeing other humans. There are no tracks suggesting pursuit, no evidence of struggle or confrontation. 5 died of exposure while attempting either shelter or return. 4 survived longer, showed enough rationality to scavenge clothing, then died from internal trauma that has no clear mechanism of injury. Radiation detected on clothing. No official explanation provided. Multiple witness reports of unusual lights in the sky on the night in question. These witnesses were interviewed by security services and ordered to remain silent. The local Mansi people claim the mountain sings, and that death follows when it does. I initially dismissed this as superstition. I am no longer certain. Whatever killed these 9 people was neither natural weather nor human violence. It was something else, something I was not meant to investigate. I believe we stumbled onto something that was being tested or studied. I believe those 9 hikers walked directly into a zone they were never meant to enter. And I believe their deaths were acceptable losses to someone who classified the incident before I could determine the truth. If I am right, then the most terrifying aspect is not what killed them. It is that whoever is responsible has the power to ensure no one ever learns why they died. I am closing this case, but I am not forgetting it. Someone, someday, must tell the truth. L. Ivanov. He locked the journal in his desk drawer and tried to sleep. Outside his window, the spring wind moved through the streets of Sverdlovsk, carrying the last cold breath of winter from the Urals. Far to the north, on a mountain the Mansi called Dead Mountain, the snow continued to melt, erasing the last physical traces of what had happened on February 1st, 1959. But the mountain remembered. 30 years later, in the winter of 1989, the old patterns were breaking. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika were loosening Soviet information controls, and secrets that had been buried for decades were beginning to surface. Archives were opening. Journalists were asking questions that had once been forbidden. Survivors were finally talking. Mikhail Sharavin, the young volunteer who discovered the tent in 1959, sat across from journalist Anatoly Gushchin in a cramped apartment in Sverdlovsk. Sharavin was 53 now, his hair grey, his hands weathered from 30 years of forestry work. But his eyes were sharp, focused, as he spoke about what he'd never been allowed to discuss publicly. "They told us we'd imagined it," Sharavin said, lighting a cigarette with fingers that trembled slightly. After the investigation closed, security officers came to interview all the volunteers. One by one, they sat us down and informed us that certain things we thought we'd seen were mistaken, that stress and cold played tricks on perception, that our memories were unreliable. "What had you seen?" Gushchin asked, his notebook open, pen ready. Sharavin took a long drag, exhaled slowly. The tent wasn't the only thing we found that day. Before we reached the campsite, as we were approaching the slope, we saw marks in the snow. Not footprints. Wrong shape, wrong depth. Like something had been dragged, or like pressure had been applied to the snow surface in patterns that made no sense. Could they have been wind patterns, snow formations? That's what I thought at first. That's what I told myself. But they led directly to the tent and then stopped. And the pattern, he paused, struggling for words. You know how snow shows traces of movement? Animal tracks, wind scoring, anything that disturbs the surface? These marks looked almost like writing, like something had inscribed symbols into the snow. Gushchin wrote quickly. "Did you photograph them?" "Yes, I had a camera with the search team. I took at least a dozen photographs of the area around the tent before we moved in closer. Those photographs were confiscated by security officers the same day. I was told they were classified evidence." "Do you remember what the marks looked like? Could you draw them?" Sharavin stubbed out his cigarette and took Gushchin's notebook. His hand moved across the page, sketching shapes from memory. Curved lines, geometric patterns, something that resembled concentric circles with radiating marks extending outward. Like this, repeated in several locations around the tent, each pattern maybe 2 meters across. Gushchin studied the drawing. He'd seen similar patterns before, in declassified documents related to Soviet research into electromagnetic phenomena. But he said nothing, letting Sharavin continue. "There's more," Sharavin said. "Something I've never told anyone because I knew no one would believe me. That night, the night we found the tent, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those 9 people, about what could make them run. So I walked away from base camp just to clear my head. I went back toward the slope where we'd found the tent." He lit another cigarette, his hand steady now, as if the act of confession was bringing him calm. It was maybe 2 a.m, clear sky, good moonlight. I was standing maybe half a kilometre from the tent site, just looking up at the mountain, and I saw a light. What kind of light? Not a fire, not a flashlight. This was orange, bright orange, and it was hovering about 100 metres above the slope, just hanging there, not moving. I watched it for maybe 5 minutes, thinking I was seeing some kind of reflection or atmospheric phenomenon. Then it started moving. Sharavin's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. It moved in a perfect grid pattern, back and forth across the slope like it was searching for something. No sound, no visible propulsion, just smooth, deliberate movement. I watched it for almost 20 minutes before it suddenly shot straight up and disappeared. "Did you report this?" I told Ivanov the next morning. He wrote it down, asked me detailed questions, seemed to take it seriously. Then security services arrived 2 days later, and I was told very clearly that I had not seen what I thought I'd seen, that it was likely moonlight reflecting off ice crystals, that my report would not be included in the official investigation. Gushchin flipped to a new page in his notebook. "Were you the only witness to unusual lights?" "No, that's what I'm trying to tell you. There were others, not from our search team, but hikers who'd been in the region during late January. The security services interviewed all of them. Most were too scared to talk afterward, but I know at least 3 groups reported seeing lights on the night of February 1st. Over the following weeks, Gushchin tracked down other witnesses. Most refused to speak on record. Some wouldn't speak at all, closing their doors when he mentioned Dyatlov. But a few, emboldened by glasnost, or perhaps simply tired of carrying secrets, were willing to talk. Vladimir Pyankov had been a 20-year-old student in 1959, leading a small hiking group approximately 50 kilometres south of Kholat-Shakhl. Now a 50-year-old mathematics teacher in Chelyabinsk, he agreed to meet Gushchin in a public park where their conversation couldn't be easily overheard. "We saw them on the night of February 1st, Pyankov said, watching children play in the snow while he spoke. 3 distinct objects, bright orange, moving across the northern horizon. We watched for about 15 minutes. They moved in patterns no aircraft could replicate. Instant acceleration, right-angle turns, hovering perfectly still." "What did you think you were seeing?" "At first, I thought military test vehicles of some kind. This was the Soviet Union in 1959. We had spacecraft programs, experimental aircraft. I assumed we were witnessing classified technology." Pyankov's expression darkened. Then the KGB came to interview us, and the way they asked questions, the things they wanted to know, made me realise they weren't just documenting our observations. They were trying to determine how much we'd understood. "What do you mean?" They asked if we'd felt anything unusual. Nausea, disorientation, ringing in our ears. They asked if we'd experienced any gaps in our memory that night, any periods where time seemed distorted. They asked if anyone in our group had nosebleeds or headaches afterward. Pyankov turned to look directly at Gushchin. "Those aren't questions you ask about people who saw lights. Those are medical questions, like they were checking for exposure to something." "What did you tell them?" "The truth, that we'd all felt fine. We were far enough away that whatever those lights were doing, it didn't affect us." He paused. "But they made us sign documents saying we'd never discuss what we'd seen. They emphasised that sharing information about classified military operations was treason. We were 20-year-old students. We signed." Gushchin found another witness through a contact at Ural Polytechnic Institute. Anatoly Bogomolov had been a geology student in 1959, part of a group doing winter field research in the northern Urals. He'd been even closer to Kholat-Syakhl than Pyankov's group, maybe 30 kilometres east. They met in Bogomolov's office at the Mining Institute, where he now worked as a professor. The shelves were lined with rock samples and technical medical journals. On the wall was a large map of the Ural Mountains with various sites marked. "I've thought about this for 30 years, Bogomolov said without pleasantries. He pulled out his own map, an old topographic chart dated 1959, and spread it across his desk. This was our survey region that winter. He pointed to a marked area. We were here, doing mineral surveys, on the night of February 1st. Clear weather, good visibility. Around 9 p.m, one of our team members called us outside. There were lights in the sky to the west. Gushchin leaned forward. Can you describe them? Spherical, orange or reddish orange. There were 4 of them moving in formation. But what caught my attention as a geologist was their behaviour. They weren't flying randomly. They were searching in a systematic grid pattern, like something was mapping the terrain from above. How long did you observe them? Almost half an hour. We had surveying equipment, including range-finding tools. I tried to calculate their altitude and distance. Based on my measurements, they were approximately 3 to 4 kilometres away, altitude perhaps 200 to 300 metres above terrain level. That would put them right over. He tapped the map. His finger landed on Kholat Syakhl. Right over Dead Mountain, Gushchin finished. Exactly. Bogomolov rolled up the map. When the KGB interviewed us, I told them about my range calculations. The officer who questioned me became very interested. He asked for all my surveying notes from that night. He confiscated my field journal. Then he told me that I was mistaken about what I'd measured, that the lights were much further away than I'd calculated, and that my observations were compromised by atmospheric distortion. But you stand by your measurements. I'm a geologist. I've spent my entire career making precise spatial measurements in difficult conditions. I know what I calculated. Bogomolov's voice was firm. Those lights were directly over the location where the Dyatlov group died, and based on witness timing, multiple groups reporting lights around the same time, whatever was happening there was happening when those 9 hikers fled their tent. Gushchin compiled the witness statements into a dossier. He had at least 7 independent witnesses describing unusual lights over Kholat Syakhl on February 1st, 1959. All had been interviewed by security services. All had been ordered to remain silent. But the most damning evidence came not from witnesses but from documents. In 1990, a former KGB archivist named Dmitry Romanenko contacted Gushchin. Romanenko had worked in the administrative offices in Sverdlovsk during the 1960s, filing and cataloguing classified materials. He was dying of cancer and wanted to clear his conscience. They met in the hospital where Romanenko was receiving treatment. He looked frail, his skin grey, but his mind was sharp. There was a memo, Romanenko said. I saw it in 1961 when I was organising files for reclassification. It was dated February 4th, 1959, 3 days after the incident but before the bodies were found. It was addressed to the head of the 9th Directorate. The 9th Directorate, responsible for security of sensitive weapons research. What did it say? Gushchin asked. I can't give you exact wording. It was 2 years after I'd seen it, and I only read it once before it was marked for deeper classification. But the content... Romanenko closed his eyes, clearly exhausted. It referenced remote atmospheric testing. It mentioned Zone 72 and civilian casualties. It recommended immediate quarantine and sanitization protocols. Sanitization of what? That's what stuck with me. The word choice was deliberate. You sanitize contaminated areas. You sanitize evidence. The memo was essentially acknowledging that something had gone wrong with the test. Civilians had died, and the situation needed to be controlled. Gushchin wrote furiously. Do you remember who signed it? No signature that I recall. Just a department designation. Department 15. Romanenko opened his eyes. I never found any other reference to Department 15 in any files I handled. It appeared only in documents related to very specific classified research. What kind of research? I can't be certain, but the few documents I saw that referenced Department 15 were all related to either acoustic weapons development or what was termed frequency-based deterrent systems. Things that use sound or electromagnetic waves to affect human behaviour. Romanenko died 3 weeks later. Gushchin attended the funeral and afterward tried to verify the information about the memo. He submitted requests to multiple archives, seeking any documents related to Department 15 or Zone 72. Every request was denied, but he did find one retired cartographer who was willing to talk, carefully, obliquely, over drinks in a noisy bar where conversations couldn't be easily overheard. Anatoly Stepochkin had spent 40 years creating topographic maps for the Ministry of Defence. He was 73 now, his hands too arthritic for fine drafting work, but his memory was excellent. Zone 72, he said, after Gushchin bought the third round. I remember that designation, January 1959. I was part of a mapping team updating military grid charts for the Northern Urals. What was special about it? We were given unusual instructions, create a restricted zone boundary for a new classified area. Small zone, maybe 15 square kilometres, but its placement was very specific. The coordinates came from an agency I'd never worked with. Just a number. Department 15. Gushchin felt his pulse quicken. Do you remember the coordinates? Better than that. I kept my old working maps. Stepochkin pulled a battered notebook from his coat pocket. Professional habit. I logged every project with date and coordinates. When this new investigation started making news, I looked it up. He flipped through pages yellow with age and found an entry dated January 27th, 1959. A set of coordinates was noted in neat handwriting. Object 72. Restricted zone established by order of Department 15. Purpose: atmospheric research. Stepochkin looked up at Gushchin. I cross-referenced these coordinates with modern maps and GPS data. The centre point of Zone 72 was within 500 metres of where the Dyatlov tent was found. The restricted zone was created 4 days before they died, Gushchin said slowly. Exactly. Whatever was being tested there, the zone was established specifically for that purpose. And here's what bothers me most. I've worked on hundreds of military projects. Usually restricted zones persist for years, decades even. They're maintained for the life of a facility or testing program. Stepochkin's voice dropped. But Zone 72 appeared in my assignments only once. It was created in late January 1959, and I never saw reference to it again. Whatever was being tested there was either temporary, or it was so sensitive that even the zone designation was erased from records. Gushchin spent the next year compiling his investigation. He had witness testimony, document references, expert analysis. He interviewed surviving family members of the victims. He tracked down former search team members. He built a comprehensive case that something classified had killed 9 hikers in 1959, and the Soviet government had covered it up. In late 1991, he prepared to publish. His editor at the newspaper was supportive but cautious. You understand this will attract attention, she said. The KGB may not have the power it once did, but institutional memory remains. People who buried secrets don't appreciate them being dug up. The truth matters, Gushchin said. Those 9 people died because they walked into something they weren't supposed to see. Their families deserve to know why. I agree. We'll publish on February 1st, 1992. The 33rd anniversary. It'll have maximum impact. Gushchin left the newspaper office feeling satisfied, vindicated. He'd spent over a year on this investigation, tracking down witnesses, verifying facts, building an undeniable case. He never made it to publication. On January 18th, 1992, Anatoly Gushchin was driving home from visiting his elderly mother in a village outside Yekaterinburg. The road was rural, poorly maintained, but he'd driven it countless times. At approximately 7:30 p.m, a military truck, witnesses reported it was green, with no visible identification markings, struck Gushchin's car from behind at high speed, driving it off the road into a drainage ditch. The truck didn't stop. It accelerated away, disappearing into the winter darkness. A passing motorist found the wreckage 40 minutes later. Gushchin was still alive but barely conscious, bleeding internally from massive trauma. The nearest hospital was 20 kilometres away. He died en route. The police investigation concluded it was a hit-and-run accident. The truck was never identified. The driver was never found. 3 days after Gushchin's death, someone broke into his apartment. Nothing of value was stolen. Not the television, not the cash in his desk drawer, not his camera equipment, but his research files on the Dyatlov case were gone. Every notebook, every photograph, every document he'd collected. His editor at the newspaper received a phone call the morning after the break-in. The caller's voice was calm, professional, completely emotionless. Further investigation into historical incidents would not be in anyone's interest, not yours, not the family's, not public interest. Some questions are better left unanswered. We trust this is understood. The line went dead. The newspaper quietly shelved the planned article. No explanation was given to readers. Gushchin's death was mentioned in a brief obituary that made no reference to his final investigation. But copies existed, witnesses remembered, and in the new Russia emerging from Soviet collapse, secrets were harder to keep than they'd once been. The truth, however incomplete, however fragmentary, was beginning to leak through the cracks. Professor Nikolai Vereshchagin taught acoustic physics at Moscow State University from 1973 until his sudden retirement in 1998. His specialty was low-frequency sound propagation, particularly regarding geological infrasound, the natural pressure waves generated by wind interacting with mountain terrain. His students considered him brilliant, if somewhat obsessive. He would spend weeks on single problems, refusing to accept answers that didn't satisfy his rigorous standards. His published papers were dense, mathematical, and highly regarded in specialized circles. But there was one problem he never published his full conclusions about: the death of 9 hikers on Kholat Syakhl in February 1959. Vereshchagin first encountered the Dyatlov case in 1983, when a colleague mentioned it during a discussion about mountain acoustics. The colleague asked if infrasound could cause the kind of mass panic that would make people flee shelter into lethal cold. Theoretically, yes, Vereshchagin had answered. Frequencies between 7 and 13 Hz can affect human physiology. Anxiety, nausea, visual distortions, even terror. But the exposure would need to be intense and sustained. The question stuck with him. Over the following years, he researched the incident obsessively, collecting what fragmentary information was available through official channels and unofficial networks. By the early 1990s, when more documents became accessible, he'd built a comprehensive technical analysis. In 1997, he published a paper in an obscure geophysics journal, Anomalous Low-Frequency Resonance Events in Ural Mountain Topology. The title was deliberately boring, designed to attract no attention beyond academic specialists. The paper presented a careful mathematical analysis of how certain mountain formations could act as natural amplifiers for infrasound. It demonstrated that the specific topology of Kholat Syakhl, combined with wind, patterns typical for early February, could theoretically generate infrasound intense enough to trigger psychological effects. The conclusion was measured and scientific. Available evidence suggests that meteorological conditions on February 1st, 1959, may have produced acoustic phenomena sufficient to explain the anomalous behaviour of the Dyatlov group. It was a compelling natural explanation. Several news outlets picked it up, running brief stories about how science might have solved a decades-old mystery. Vereshchagin let them run with it. He didn't correct them. He didn't explain that the published paper was deliberately misleading, because he didn't believe his own conclusion. The truth was buried in data he'd collected but never published. Meteorological records from multiple stations surrounding Dead Mountain on February 1st, 1959. He'd obtained the raw data through academic connections before realizing how sensitive it might be. Using barometric pressure readings, wind speed measurements, and temperature gradients, Vereshchagin had calculated the expected infrasound signature for that night with precision. Natural infrasound generated by wind moving over mountain terrain would produce frequencies between 8 and 11 Hz, fluctuating randomly with wind gusts, changing pitch constantly. But testimony from witnesses, both the hikers who'd seen lights and the search team members who'd later investigated, described something different. They'd reported hearing or feeling humming, vibration, pressure that was steady, rhythmic, almost musical. Vereshchagin had cross-referenced these descriptions with his calculated natural frequencies. They didn't match. What witnesses described was consistent with a tone around 9.2 Hz, with precise harmonic intervals layered on top. Not chaotic natural sound, but modulated, structured frequencies, infrasound that had been shaped by technology. In 1998, Vereshchagin gave a single interview to a small investigative magazine. The journalist, a young woman named Svetlana Orlova, had contacted him after reading his published paper and noticing inconsistencies in his mathematical models. They met in Vereshchagin's office at the university, a cluttered space lined with acoustic equipment, monitoring devices, and shelves packed with journals and papers. Vereshchagin was 63, thin and intense, with the distracted air of someone whose mind was perpetually calculating. "You noticed the discrepancies," he said as soon as Orlova sat down. "Not a question." "Your paper presents infrasound as a natural phenomenon," she replied, "but your calculations include variables that suggest artificial modulation. The harmonic ratios are too precise for random wind generation." Vereshchagin smiled slightly. "You're more perceptive than most of my colleagues." "Yes. The published paper says what I was willing to say publicly. What I actually believe is different." He pulled a folder from his desk, thick with data, printouts, spectral analysis charts, and handwritten notes. Starting in 1957, the Soviet Ministry of Defense began experimenting with infrasound as a crowd control mechanism, he said. The theory was elegant. Deploy a device that generates precise low-frequency waves, induce panic in enemy troops without firing a shot, make them flee their positions, abandon equipment, lose all unit cohesion. Acoustic weapons. Exactly. But not weapons designed to cause direct physical harm. Weapons designed to manipulate behavior through induced terror. Vereshchagin spread several documents across his desk. The research was classified under Department 15. I found references to it in declassified budgetary documents from the late 1950s, significant funding for frequency-based deterrent systems research. How does this relate to Dyatlov? I believe the 9 hikers walked directly into a field test. Vereshchagin's voice was steady, clinical. The test zone was established in late January 1959. We have cartographic evidence of that. The experiment was scheduled for February 1st, but no one knew there was a civilian group camping inside the test boundary. The Dyatlov group was supposed to be 30 kilometers south according to their filed route. Weather delays put them exactly at ground zero. He pulled out a spectral analysis chart. Based on witness descriptions of what they heard or felt, I calculated the likely frequency signature. 9.2 Hz primary tone with harmonic overtones at precise intervals. This pattern doesn't occur naturally. It requires technology, specifically a large-scale acoustic generator. What would that do to people? At sufficient intensity, infrasound at 9 to 10 Hz induces extreme psychological effects. Fight or flight response escalates to terror. Rational decision-making collapses. The body's stress response maxes out. Vereshchagin traced a finger along the chart. But it's not just psychological. At high intensity, these frequencies cause physical resonance in soft tissue. Organs begin to vibrate at their natural frequencies. Blood vessels can rupture. Internal structures can be damaged. Orlova felt her stomach tighten. The internal injuries, the crushed ribs with no external trauma. Precisely. Prolonged exposure to modulated infrasound could cause exactly the injuries the pathologist documented. Internal trauma from resonance, tissue damage that appears to have no external cause. And the missing tongues? Vereshchagin hesitated. That's harder to explain with infrasound alone. But there are documented cases of extreme resonance exposure causing selective tissue damage in areas with high concentrations of nerve endings. The tongue, the eyes. These are among the most innervated tissues in the body. If the frequency was precisely tuned, if the exposure was prolonged enough. He trailed off. I'm speculating, but it's possible. So your theory is that they were killed by a Soviet acoustic weapon test? My theory is that they were exposed to something that induced overwhelming terror and caused resonance-based tissue damage. Whether that was intentional testing or an accident, I can't say. But the pattern of events, the organised flight from the tent, the attempt to shelter, the internal injuries, all of it is consistent with exposure to weaponized infrasound. Orlova wrote quickly, her shorthand filling pages. Why publish a paper saying it was natural phenomena if you don't believe that? Because I wanted to be able to continue working, continue living. Vereshchagin's expression hardened. 6 months ago, I received a visit from 2 men who identified themselves as consultants with the Ministry of Defence. They were very polite. They complimented my research. They asked detailed questions about my methodologies. What did they want? They wanted to know if I'd found any documentary evidence of weapons testing in 1959. They wanted to know if I'd calculated specific technical parameters that might reveal how such a system would work. They wanted to know who else I'd shared my findings with. He paused. And then they advised me, very cordially, very professionally, that further research into acoustic phenomena related to the Dyatlov incident would not be supported by the university, and that academic freedom did not extend to compromising state security. They threatened you. They didn't need to threaten explicitly. The message was clear. I could publish a paper suggesting natural causes, or I could find myself without a position, without funding, without access to research facilities. Vereshchagin gestured at the folder of unpublished data. So I published what I was allowed to publish. And I'm telling you the truth now, because I don't know how much time I have to tell it. What do you mean? I'm being followed. My office has been searched, subtly, but I notice when things are moved. My phone makes clicking sounds that weren't there before. He looked directly at Orlova. I'm going public with this now because I need someone else to know. If something happens to me, I want the truth to survive. Orlova published the interview 4 months later in her magazine, a small circulation publication focused on investigative journalism. The article generated modest attention, mostly in academic circles interested in Soviet weapons development. 3 months after publication, Professor Nikolai Vereshchagin died of a massive heart attack while working late in his university office. He was 63 years old with no prior cardiac history. The university held a memorial service praising his contributions to acoustic physics. His research files on the Dyatlov incident disappeared from his office before his family could claim his belongings. The official explanation was that they'd been mistakenly disposed of during office cleaning. Svetlana Orlova tried to follow up on Vereshchagin's research, but found that every lead went cold. Former colleagues wouldn't talk. Archive requests were denied. The few people who'd worked on acoustic weapons programs in the 1950s were either dead or unreachable. She filed Vereshchagin's story away, adding it to the growing collection of fragmentary evidence that something terrible had been done to 9 hikers in 1959, and someone very powerful wanted to ensure the truth never fully emerged. The pattern was consistent once you learned to recognize it. Anyone who investigated the Dyatlov incident too deeply experienced misfortune. Not always dramatic, sometimes subtle. A lost job, a stolen research file, a warning delivered by serious men in dark coats. But occasionally the misfortune was permanent. Anatoly Gushchin, the journalist who'd compiled witness testimonies, died in a hit-and-run in 1992. Professor Vereshchagin, who'd analysed the acoustic evidence, died of sudden heart failure in 1998. A forensic pathologist named Mikhail Levin, who'd attempted to publish a detailed analysis of the internal injuries in 2003, had his medical license suspended after allegations of research misconduct that were never substantiated. A documentary filmmaker named Irina Volkov, who'd shot extensive footage in the Urals in 2007, had her equipment confiscated by customs officials when trying to leave Russia. The footage was never returned. Each incident could be explained individually as coincidence or bad luck. Together they formed a pattern of systematic suppression. But perhaps the most compelling testimony came not from researchers or journalists, but from the people who'd lived alongside the mountains for generations. In 2003, anthropologist Tatyana Pavlova spent 6 months living with a Mansi community in the northern Urals. Her research focused on traditional ecological knowledge, how indigenous peoples understood and interacted with their environment. She wasn't initially looking for information about the Dyatlov incident, but the incident found her anyway. She'd been in the community for 3 months when an elder named Pavel Konstantinov invited her to tea. He was 87, one of the last living members of his generation who still remembered the old ways, who still spoke Mansi as a first language. They sat in his small wooden house while wind howled outside. Pavel prepared tea in silence, his movements slow and deliberate. When he finally spoke, it was in Russian, heavily accented by his native tongue. "You study how my people understand the world," he said. "You write down our knowledge of plants, of animals, of weather." "Yes," Tatyana replied, "if you're willing to share. There are things we do not usually share, things outsiders do not believe. But you listen with respect, so I will tell you about the mountain." He poured tea, steam rising between them. "You know which mountain I mean?" "Kholat Shachel." "Yes. In Russian you call it Dead Mountain. In Mansi the name is older, more specific. It means the mountain that swallows sound." Pavel wrapped his weathered hands around his teacup. "We do not go there in winter, not when the sky is restless. Our people have known for generations that the mountain sings. When it sings, the rules change." "What do you mean by singing?" "A sound you feel more than hear. It comes from below and above at the same time. It makes your chest tight, your thoughts scatter, like the world is vibrating at the wrong frequency." He paused, searching for words. "In the old stories, hunters who heard the singing would run until their hearts burst. They could not control themselves. The sound entered them and made them into something else." Tatyana wrote carefully, trying to capture his exact phrasing. "Has the mountain sung in your lifetime?" 3 times I've felt it. Once when I was a boy, maybe 10 years old. I was hunting with my father and uncle near the tree line. We felt the pressure begin, that tightness in the chest. My father immediately ordered us to leave. We ran for hours, didn't stop until we were beyond the river. He said we'd been lucky to feel only the beginning. If we'd stayed, we would have been lost. When were the other times? Once in my 40s, once about 15 years ago. Pavel's eyes were distant, remembering. The mountain does not sing often. Maybe once in a generation, maybe longer. But when it does, death follows. Did the mountain sing in February 1959? Pavel set down his teacup. For a long moment he was silent. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes. I was not there, but others told me. The outsiders, the ones who died. They pitched their tent in the throat of the mountain, right where the singing is loudest. They did not know the signs. They did not leave offerings. They did not understand where they were. What should they have done? Left immediately. The first time you feel the pressure, the first time the air feels wrong, you leave. You do not try to understand. You do not try to be brave. You leave." His voice was firm, certain. But these were Soviet people, scientists, students. They did not believe in things they could not measure. So when the mountain began to sing, they probably tried to reason, tried to find explanation, and while they reasoned, the singing got stronger. Is the singing natural, part of the mountain itself? Pavel considered this carefully. The mountain has always sung sometimes. That is its nature. But that night, he hesitated. That night, there was something else, another voice, not of the mountain, not of this world. Tatyana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "What do you mean?" "My cousin was hunting in the region that week. He was far enough away to be safe, but close enough to see. He saw lights in the sky moving over the mountain, strange lights, wrong colours, and he felt something that made him run. Not the singing of the mountain, but something worse, like the mountain was answering something, like it had been called." "Called by what?" Pavel's expression was troubled. "In the old stories, there are things that exist in the spaces between. Not in our world, not fully. They exist where sound becomes solid, where pressure becomes presence. The mountain is a thin place, a boundary. Usually the boundary holds, but sometimes..." He made a gesture like tearing fabric. "Sometimes something tries to cross, or is invited to cross." "You think the hiker summoned something?" "No. The outsiders did not know enough to summon anything, but someone else did. Someone who understood how to use sound as a key, who knew the mountain could be opened. Pavel looked directly at her. This was not an accident. This was an experiment, and 9 people died because they were in the wrong place when someone tried to open a door that should stay closed. Tatiana spent weeks trying to verify Pavel's account through other sources. Other Mansi elders were reluctant to speak about Dead Mountain, but those who did shared similar core beliefs. The mountain was a thin place, a boundary. It sang when the boundary was stressed, and in February 1959, something had happened there that was not entirely natural. She published her findings in an academic anthropology journal in 2005, carefully framing everything as indigenous knowledge systems and phenomenological interpretation, rather than objective fact. Even so, she received criticism from colleagues who felt she was giving undue credence to superstition. But she also received contact from unexpected sources. A retired geophysicist sent her research papers on electromagnetic anomalies in the Urals. A former military officer sent her an anonymous letter describing classified projects he'd worked on in the 1960s related to atmospheric pressure manipulation. An American physicist named Elizabeth Marsh sent her declassified CIA documents about Soviet acoustic weapons research. The evidence was fragmentary, circumstantial, often unverifiable. But it all pointed in the same direction. Something had been tested on Koletsiakl in February 1959. 9 people had died as a result, and the truth had been deliberately buried under decades of official denial and active suppression. In 2019, the Russian government announced it was reopening the Dyatlov investigation. After 60 years, new conclusions would be drawn using modern forensic techniques and updated understanding. The announcement generated international media attention. Finally, many thought, the mystery would be solved. 6 months later, the new official conclusion was released. Avalanche. The report claimed that a delayed slab avalanche had struck the tent, causing the hikers to flee in panic. The internal injuries were explained as consistent with avalanche trauma. The radiation was dismissed as irrelevant background contamination. The cut tent was explained as the result of attempts to escape from under snow. The conclusion satisfied almost no one. Avalanche experts pointed out that the slope angle was insufficient, the snow conditions were wrong, and no avalanche debris field existed. Forensic pathologists noted that avalanche trauma produces specific injury patterns not present in the Dyatlov victims. Radiation specialists questioned why only certain items of clothing showed contamination if it was merely background radiation. But the case was officially closed again. Media attention faded. The Dyatlov Pass incident returned to its status as an unsolved mystery, relegated to lists alongside other strange deaths and unexplained phenomena. Except for those who'd spent years investigating. They recognised the 2019 conclusion for what it was. Not a genuine investigation, but a maintenance exercise. A way to close public discussion while revealing nothing. The message was clear. After 60 years, someone still wanted this case to remain officially unexplained. Which meant that whatever had killed 9 hikers in 1959 remained relevant to someone in power. The truth was still dangerous. Marcus Holloway wasn't looking for Dyatlov when he found it. The American researcher was investigating Cold War-era intelligence operations for a book about CIA surveillance programs. His access to declassified documents was extensive, if bureaucratically tedious. Years of FOIA requests, hundreds of documents with sections redacted into incomprehensibility. In 2019, he was reviewing recently declassified materials from 1961 when he noticed a pattern in the redactions. Certain phrases appeared repeatedly in documents from different departments, all heavily redacted, all referencing Soviet research programs that the CIA had been monitoring. Bioacoustic weapon systems appeared 17 times. Department 15 appeared 13 times. Threshold protocol appeared 6 times. Holloway cross-referenced these terms, looking for documents where multiple appeared together. He found one. A CIA memorandum dated March 1961, discussing Soviet military research priorities. The document was mostly redacted, entire paragraphs blacked out, but fragments remained. Continued monitoring of Soviet research into bioacoustic weapon systems indicates redacted has achieved limited success in field applications. Intelligence suggests February 1959 testing in Ural region resulted in redacted. Civilian casualties confirmed. Recommend increased surveillance of redacted facilities and personnel associated with Department 15. Particular attention should be paid to redacted designated threshold protocol, which may represent redacted breakthrough in resonance-induced redacted. February 1959. Ural region. Civilian casualties. Holloway knew enough about Cold War history to recognise that combination. The Dyatlov incident had occurred in February 1959 in the Ural Mountains. 9 civilian casualties. Was the CIA monitoring what happened to the Dyatlov group? He submitted additional FOIA requests, specifically targeting documents mentioning both acoustic weapons and the Urals. Most were denied outright. A few came back so heavily redacted they were useless. But he did receive one document, a signals intelligence report from 1962. The report described intercepted Soviet radio transmissions from military facilities in the Urals. Most was standard encrypted communication, but one section caught Holloway's attention. Low-frequency pulse transmissions detected from facility designated URL-7, frequency 9.2 Hz with harmonic overtones. Pattern analysis suggests test of resonance generation system. Duration, approximately 45 minutes. Recommend continued monitoring as potential weapons application. 9.2 Hz, the same frequency Professor Vereshchagin had calculated for the Dyatlov night. Holloway's research hit a wall. Every further FOIA request was denied on national security grounds. He reached out to former intelligence officers he'd developed as sources for his book. None would discuss Department 15 or Threshold Protocol on record. 2 refused to discuss them at all, even off record. He posted his findings on a private research forum, hoping to crowdsource additional information. The forum was small, focused on Cold War intelligence, populated by serious researchers rather than conspiracy theorists. The response was immediate. Within hours, multiple forum members had contributed relevant documents, analysis, and theories. One member, who went by the username ArchiveGhost, sent a private message. "You're looking at this incorrectly. The Dyatlov event was not a weapons test that failed. It was a threshold experiment that succeeded. Department 15 was not trying to build a crowd control device. They were attempting to prove a hypothesis about resonance and dimensional permeability. The 9 hikers died because they became the focal point of something that was summoned, not created." The message continued. Review satellite thermal imaging of Kholat Syakhl from 1997, 2009 and 2021. Notice the pattern. Holloway initially dismissed it as conspiracy theorist nonsense. Dimensional permeability, summoning. It sounded like bad science fiction. But the specificity of the dates bothered him. Why those particular years? Out of curiosity, he accessed publicly available thermal satellite data for the northern Urals region. The data was used for geological surveys, environmental monitoring and climate studies, completely routine, completely unclassified. In June 1997, thermal sensors had detected an anomalous heat signature over Kholat Syakhl, a localized temperature spike of approximately 15 degrees Celsius in an area where no geological thermal activity should exist. The anomaly had lasted for 72 hours, then vanished. Holloway checked August 2009. Another thermal anomaly. Same location, same intensity, same duration. October 2021. Same pattern. He calculated backward. If the anomalies occurred on a regular cycle, previous events would have been in 1985, 1973, 1961. He checked historical records. In September 1973, Soviet geologists had reported unusual seismic readings near Kholat Syakhl. Not earthquakes, but rhythmic vibrations lasting approximately 3 days. In November 1985, Russian atmospheric researchers had recorded unexplained electromagnetic interference in the same region, again lasting roughly 72 hours, 12-year intervals, perfectly consistent across 6 decades. Something was recurring at that location, something that generated heat, produced vibrations, and created electromagnetic distortions. And if the pattern held, it had been happening since before the Dyatlov incident. Holloway calculated further back, 1949, 1937, 1924. The manifestations went back beyond reliable record-keeping. But the 12-year cycle suggested something fundamental, either a natural geological process operating on an unusual timetable, or something artificial that had been installed and was still operating. Holloway returned to the message from archived Sign Ghost, threshold experiment that succeeded. He began researching Soviet fringe science programs from the 1950s. Most were dead ends, propaganda claims, failed projects, experiments that went nowhere. But he found references to a project called Threshold Protocol in a single declassified paragraph from a CIA assessment of Soviet weapons development. Project designated Threshold Protocol, allegedly disbanded 1965, stated objective: investigate resonance-induced apertures in space-time topology. No confirmed results. Program assessment. Theoretical speculation with no practical weapons application. Resonance-induced apertures. In plain language, using sound to open doorways. The CIA had dismissed it as theoretical speculation. But what if they'd been wrong? What if the Soviets had actually succeeded? Holloway contacted Archive Ghost again, asking for more information. The response took 3 days. I can't provide documentary proof. Those files don't exist in accessible form anymore. But I worked in Soviet science administration in the 1960s. I saw references to Threshold Protocol results. The experiment on February 1st, 1959 was designed to test whether focused acoustic energy could create a temporary aperture between dimensional states. They chose an isolated location, set up the equipment, ran the test. The aperture opened. Something came through. 9 civilians were in the exact wrong place when it happened. They were the focal point of crossing energies, caught between 2 states of reality. Their deaths were the cost of proving the hypothesis. But here's what you need to understand. The aperture didn't close completely. It was supposed to collapse immediately after the test. Instead, it stabilized into a weak point, a permanent thin spot in reality. Every 12 years, the resonance builds again. The aperture pulses, the thermal anomalies, the electromagnetic interference. Those are symptoms of it trying to open wider. Department 15 maintained observation protocols for decades. After the Soviet collapse, the protocols were transferred to successor agencies. Someone, somewhere in the Russian government, is still monitoring Kolatsyakhl, still tracking the 12-year cycle, still making sure whatever was summoned in 1959 doesn't spread. The message ended with a warning. Stop asking questions about this. You're attracting attention you don't want. I'm sending this from a terminal that can't be traced to me, and I won't contact you again. The people who buried this truth are still active. They will protect it. Holloway tried to respond, but Archive to Ghost's account had been deleted. He spent weeks trying to verify the information, but every lead evaporated. He considered abandoning the research. It was too speculative, too far removed from his main project, and frankly too disturbing. Then he received a contact from an unexpected source. Elizabeth Marsh was a retired American physicist, 78 years old, living in New Mexico. She'd worked for the National Security Agency from 1961 to 1983, specializing in signals intelligence and acoustic analysis. She'd read Holloway's forum posts. Someone had forwarded them to her, and she had information to share. They spoke by phone. Her voice was sharp, clear, the voice of someone whose mind remained excellent despite advanced age. In 1962, I was part of a team analysing unusual radio transmissions intercepted from Soviet facilities in the Urals, she said. Most were standard military communications, but one recording was different. Extremely low-frequency pulses, almost subsonic, modulated in patterns that showed mathematical structure. What kind of patterns? That's what took us months to figure out. The primary frequency was 9.2 Hz. That's infrasound, below normal hearing range, but embedded within it were harmonic overtones that formed a sequence, a code. What did it encode? Spatial coordinates and timestamps. We thought initially it was navigation data for missiles or aircraft, but the pattern was wrong for that. The coordinates were all the same location, a point in the northern Urals, but the timestamps were different, multiple dates, all precisely 12 years apart. Holloway felt his pulse quicken. What dates? February 1st, 1959, February 1st, 1971, February 1st, 1983. The pattern continued forward at 12-year intervals. We logged it, noted it in our reports, and moved on. It didn't seem immediately relevant to weapon systems or military planning. But now I understand what we were looking at. It wasn't navigation data, it was a schedule, a timetable for recurrence. Marsh's voice dropped slightly. Whatever the Soviets opened in 1959, they knew it wouldn't stay closed. They were documenting when it would pulse again, and they embedded that timetable in their testing transmission. Whether as a record or a warning, I don't know. The sequence continued forward, past 1983. Yes. February 1st, 1995. February 1st, 2007. February 1st, 2019, Marsh paused. The next date in the sequence is February 1st, 2031. Holloway did the math. Less than a decade away. Do you still have the original recordings? He asked. No, they were classified, then reclassified when I retired. I kept my analysis notes, against protocol, because I knew this was unusual. But the original intercepts are buried somewhere in NSA archives. She hesitated. I'm telling you this because I think someone needs to know. The pattern is real. Something was installed or created at that location in 1959, and it's still operating on a 12-year cycle. Whatever is happening there, it's not over. After the call ended, Holloway sat in his office surrounded by documents, data, and fragments of a story that refused to come into focus. He had evidence of something. A pattern, a cycle, a recurring phenomenon. But what exactly? He thought about 9 hikers who'd fled their tent in terror, about internal injuries that had no external cause, about lights in the sky and missing tongues and radiation on clothing, about witnesses who'd been silenced and researchers who'd died, and a cover-up that had persisted for over 60 years. And he thought about a thermal anomaly that would pulse again in 2031, less than a decade away, about a 12-year cycle that had been running since at least 1959, possibly longer, about something that had been summoned and had not left. The most disturbing realization wasn't what had killed the Dyatlov group. It was that someone in power knew about the recurring phenomenon and had decided the appropriate response was not to fix it or eliminate it, but to monitor it and keep it secret, which meant either they couldn't stop it or they didn't want to stop it. Either possibility was terrifying. Igor Dyatlov's diary was recovered from the tent, pages frozen but intact. His final entry, dated February 1st, 1959, at approximately 6 p.m, contained routine notes about camp setup and weather conditions. The entry ended mid-sentence. We set up the tent on the slope. Wind is fierce, but tent is secure. Everyone is well. We'll attempt to reach... Nothing more. Whatever happened occurred minutes or perhaps seconds after those words were written. The group had time to cut their way out of the tent, but not time to dress. They had time to run 1,000 meters, but not time to stay together properly. They had time to try building a fire, but not time to save themselves. And somewhere in those final hours, 9 people learned something that broke them. Something they saw, felt, or understood that was so overwhelming that death in the snow became preferable to staying near it. The tent was eventually removed from the mountain, stored in archives as evidence, but the location where it stood remained. Hikers still visit Kholat Syakhl. Most report nothing unusual, just brutal cold, difficult terrain, and the eerie knowledge that 9 people died there. But occasionally, someone reports something else. In 2018, a hiking group passing near the site described feeling pressure in their chests, a sensation of being watched, and hearing a low humming that seemed to come from the mountain itself. They left the area quickly, later saying they couldn't shake the feeling that staying would be dangerous. In 2020, a solo hiker camping about 500 metres from the Dyatlov site reported waking in the middle of the night to see orange lights moving across the slope. He watched for several minutes before becoming overwhelmed with inexplicable terror. He abandoned his camp and hiked through the night to reach the tree line, unable to explain why he'd felt such intense fear. In 2023, a research team conducting geological surveys reported equipment malfunctions near the site. GPS devices losing signal, cameras producing distorted images, electronic compasses spinning randomly. The malfunctions stopped once they moved a kilometre away. These reports are infrequent enough to be dismissed as coincidence or imagination, but they cluster around certain times, and if you map them chronologically, they occur most often in years ending in 1 or 2, the years before and during the 12-year cycle. Local Mansi guides have stopped taking clients to Dead Mountain during winter. When asked why, they offer practical reasons: weather, avalanche risk, difficult access. But among themselves they say something different. They say the mountain is singing again, and this time they can hear 2 voices. The next manifestation window, according to the pattern documented by Elizabeth Marsh, opens on February 1st, 2031. Satellite monitoring continues, thermal sensors are positioned, electromagnetic monitoring equipment watches the mountain constantly. Someone is preparing for the next pulse. Someone wants to know what will happen when the cycle renews again. Whether that someone plans to prevent what happens, study what happens, or potentially amplify what happens remains unclear, but the pattern suggests this: whatever was opened on February 1st, 1959, when 9 hikers fled their tent and ran to their deaths, has not closed. It pulses, it persists, it waits, and every 12 years, for approximately 72 hours, the boundary between what is here and what is not here becomes thin enough that something can almost cross through. Almost. The Dyatlov protocol was supposed to be a one-time experiment, a test of whether resonance could create apertures, whether sound could be used as a key to unlock spaces between realities. The experiment succeeded, but success created a problem that has persisted for over 6 decades. The aperture won't fully close. It's stabilised into a permanent weak point, a threshold that pulses with disturbing regularity. 9 people died, proving it was possible to open doorways with sound. How many will die learning that what was opened can't be shut? The mountain keeps its secrets, but it also keeps its schedule. February 1st, 2031. Mark your calendars. When the mountain sings, run. Mansi proverb. This story is a work of fiction inspired by the real and tragically unsolved deaths of 9 hikers in the Ural Mountains in February 1959. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the most compelling mysteries of the 20th century. Many of the facts presented here are real. The circumstances of the deaths, the physical evidence found at the scene, the internal injuries with no external cause, the radiation detected on clothing, reports of lights in the sky, and the insufficient official explanations. The interpretations, theories, and explanations regarding acoustic weapons, Department 15, dimensional thresholds, and recurring patterns are fictional creations designed to explore one possible narrative behind the documented evidence. The 9 victims, Igor Dyatlov, Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonishenko, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin, Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolovatov, and Nicholas Thibault Brignol, were real people who died in circumstances that remain unexplained. They deserve to be remembered as the skilled, experienced and courageous individuals they were. Whatever the truth of what happened on Kholat Syakhl on February 1st, 1959, it remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. A massive thank you to Vortex9119 for this incredible video suggestion. If you have story ideas you'd like to see brought to life, drop them in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these immersive tales, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more stories that blur the line between mystery and reality. What if I told you that buried beneath a 1,000-year-old chapel in Ethiopia lies something so powerful that governments have spent decades ensuring you never learn about it? What if every conflict, every war, every uprising in that region wasn't random chaos, but a response to something ancient awakening? My name is Alex Morrison, and 3 months ago, I was just another satellite imaging technician, analysing ground-penetrating radar for a living. Now I'm hiding in a cabin in rural Montana, and I may be the only person alive who knows the truth about what's really buried in Axum. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway. That's what you do when you're 3 weeks behind on satellite analysis reports, and your supervisor keeps sending those passive-aggressive emails with red exclamation points. I was a field technician for Orbital Dynamics, a mid-tier satellite imaging company that contracted with everyone from agricultural firms to mining corporations. My job was simple: analyse ground-penetrating radar scans, identify subsurface anomalies and file reports. Nothing glamorous, nothing dangerous, just data. The Horn of Africa cluster had been sitting on my desk for 2 days. Standard geological survey for a potential infrastructure project in Ethiopia. Roads, power lines, the usual development stuff that required knowing what lay beneath the surface. I'd already processed 47 grids of unremarkable sediment layers and bedrock formations when I opened grid 48. The image loaded pixel by pixel, revealing the familiar topography of northern Ethiopia. Rolling hills, scattered vegetation, and the ancient town of Axum with its towering obelisks and stone churches. But there, beneath the church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, was something that made my breath catch in my throat. A perfect geometric void. Not a cave, not a natural formation. The radar signature showed clean, straight edges forming a rectangular shape, approximately 4 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and 2.5 feet deep. The dimensions were so precise they could have been cut with industrial equipment. Yet the surrounding rock layers indicated this void had existed for centuries, possibly millennia. I pulled up the analysis protocols on my second monitor. Standard procedure for unexplained anomalies was clear. Mark as geological inconsistency or data corruption, and move on. The company didn't pay us to solve mysteries, just to identify potential construction hazards. But those dimensions nagged at me. 4 feet by 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet. I'd heard those measurements before, in some half-remembered history class or documentary. Something biblical. I saved the image to my personal drive before marking the official report as data corruption. Recommend resurvey. My supervisor would approve it without a second glance, and the client would order new scans of the area that would somehow never quite capture that same perfect void again. As I prepared to move on to the next grid, I noticed something else in the metadata. The thermal overlay showed heat signatures throughout the scan area, solar absorption on the surface, geothermal activity deeper down, all normal patterns, except for the void. The void was 3 degrees warmer than the surrounding rock despite being completely enclosed. Dead objects don't generate heat. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, but no amount of analysis could explain what I was looking at. Finally, I closed the file and went home, but the image followed me. Those perfect dimensions, that impossible heat signature, the way it sat directly beneath one of Christianity's most sacred sites. 4 feet by 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet. The traditional dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant. That night, I dreamed of golden cherubim with wings spread wide, and a voice that spoke from between them with the sound of rushing water. In the dream, I was standing in a stone chamber, lit by a light that cast no shadows, reaching toward a box that hummed with power. The moment my fingers touched the gold, I woke with a gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just my imagination running wild after a long day staring at radar scans. But when I checked my phone, I found I'd been unconsciously searching for information about Axum, about the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, about ancient artefacts hidden beneath holy ground. The next morning I couldn't focus on anything else. I pulled up the scan again, studying every pixel, every thermal gradient, every impossible detail of that buried void. This wasn't data corruption. This was something real, something significant, something that had been deliberately hidden from the world. Something that was waiting. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Ethiopia. I'd convinced my supervisor that the Axum anomaly required ground truthing, a field verification to ensure our radar systems were functioning correctly. The company approved the trip because it sounded technical and responsible, not because I'd spent every spare moment researching the legend of the Ark's journey from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. According to tradition, the Queen of Sheba took the Ark back to Ethiopia after her visit to King Solomon. Her son, Menelik I, founded the Ethiopian Empire and established Axum as its capital. For 3,000 years, Ethiopian Orthodox Christians had claimed the true Ark of the Covenant rested in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, guarded by a single monk who could never leave the sacred precinct. Tourist nonsense, I'd always assumed. Every culture claimed to have some piece of biblical history hidden in their backyard. But now I had radar evidence of something buried exactly where the legend said it would be. Something that matched the Ark's traditional dimensions and somehow generated heat despite being entombed in solid rock. I landed in Addis Ababa on a Tuesday morning and caught a domestic flight to Axum the same day. The town was smaller than I'd expected, a collection of low buildings scattered around the famous obelisk park and the twin churches that claimed to house the world's greatest religious relic. Tourists wandered between the ancient stone monuments, taking selfies with 3,000-year-old carved pillars, while guides recited well-practiced speeches about Queen Sheba and King Solomon. I hired a local guide named Dawit, a middle-aged man with intelligent eyes and careful English who specialised in the historical sites. We spent the first day touring the obelisk park and the ruins of ancient palaces, but I was really just getting a feel for the area, trying to match the topography to my radar scans. Tomorrow we visit the churches, Dawit said as we walked back to my hotel. The old church and the new church. Very sacred places. Can tourists go inside both churches? I asked, trying to sound casual. The new church, yes. Beautiful paintings, ancient books, many treasures. But the old church... He paused, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. The old church is different. Only priests allowed inside and the guardian. The guardian? One monk, chosen for life. He watches over the... Dawit lowered his voice. Over what is kept there. He can never leave the church grounds. Never. He stays until he dies. Then another is chosen. We'd reached my hotel, but I wasn't ready to end the conversation. What exactly is he guarding? Dawit looked uncomfortable. Christians say it is the Tablet, the Ark of Moses. Others say it is just tradition, just stories. But I have lived in Axum all my life, and I tell you this, the guardian is real. I have seen him walking in the church courtyard at night, always alone, always watching. What does he look like? Old, but not in years. Old in ... Dawit struggled for the word. Old in soul. Like a man who has seen too much, carries too much weight. His eyes. He shuddered. I do not like to look at his eyes. That night I lay in bed studying satellite photos of the church complex on my laptop. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion was actually 2 buildings. A newer church built in the 1960s where tourists and worshippers could visit, and a smaller, older chapel that supposedly housed the Ark. The older building sat directly above the void I detected in the radar scan. According to everything I'd read, no outsider had been permitted inside the chapel in centuries. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained absolute secrecy about what was housed there, allowing only the guardian and select high-ranking clergy to enter. Even the country's government respected the restriction, treating the chapel as sovereign territory beyond their jurisdiction. But tomorrow, I'd at least be able to see the building from the outside, maybe get close enough to take some thermal readings with the handheld scanner I'd brought. It wasn't much, but it might help me understand what was generating that heat signature 12 feet below ground. The next morning, Dawit led me through Axum's narrow streets toward the church complex. We passed market stalls selling coffee and spices, elderly women spinning cotton on wooden wheels, children playing soccer with a ball made of rags. Normal life in a normal town that happened to claim possession of humanity's most powerful religious artifact. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion compound was surrounded by a high stone wall with an ornate gate. Beyond the entrance I could see the modern church with its painted dome and arched windows, and behind that, partially hidden by trees, the smaller chapel that supposedly housed the Ark. "We can tour the new church," DeWitt explained as we approached the gate. "Beautiful interior, many ancient paintings and manuscripts, but the chapel behind it." He pointed to the smaller building. "That is forbidden." We passed through the gate into a courtyard filled with pilgrims and tourists. The modern church was indeed impressive, with colourful frescoes covering every wall and elaborate religious artefacts displayed in glass cases. But I found myself constantly glancing toward the windows that faced the restricted chapel, trying to catch a glimpse of the building that sat above my mysterious void. After an hour of dutifully admiring religious art, I excused myself to use the restroom, then slipped outside into the courtyard. The restricted chapel was maybe 50 yards away, separated from the public area by a low fence and some carefully placed shrubs. I walked casually in that direction, pulling out my phone as if taking pictures of the church architecture. The chapel was older than the main building, constructed from rough stone blocks that had been weathered smooth by centuries of highland rain. Small, narrow windows pierced the walls at regular intervals, but they were too high and too dark to see inside. The building's footprint was roughly 30 feet by 40 feet, large enough to house a small congregation, or to contain something that required a significant amount of protective space. As I was trying to estimate the building's exact position relative to my radar scan, a figure appeared in one of the windows. The Guardian. Even from 50 yards away I could see that Dawit hadn't exaggerated. The man's face was gaunt to the point of being skeletal, his skin pale as parchment despite Ethiopia's intense sun. But it was his eyes that made my breath catch, dark, hollow, ancient in a way that had nothing to do with age. Eyes that had seen something no human should see, carried some weight that was slowly crushing the life out of him. For a long moment we stared at each other across the courtyard. Then the Guardian raised one thin hand and made a clear gesture. "Go away." Not a casual dismissal, but an urgent warning, the kind of motion you'd make to stop someone from stepping into traffic. As I watched, his lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "You don't want what's inside." Then he disappeared from the window, leaving me standing in the courtyard with my heart hammering and my thermal scanner forgotten in my pocket. The Guardian hadn't just been warning me away from the chapel. He'd been warning me away from whatever was buried beneath it, whatever was generating that impossible heat signature 12 feet underground. Whatever had been slowly killing him with its proximity for however many years he'd been trapped in that building. I found Dawit waiting by the main church entrance, looking concerned. "You saw him," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah. Then you understand why I do not like to look at his eyes. Come, we should go. There are other sights to see, happier places." But as we left the church compound, I couldn't stop thinking about that desperate gesture, that silent warning. The Guardian knew something was down there, something that had been affecting him for years, possibly decades, something that pulsed with heat and waited in the darkness beneath ancient stone. That night I called my supervisor and extended my stay in Ethiopia by a week. Back in my hotel room, I spread out printed satellite photos across the bed and fired up my laptop. The thermal scanner I'd brought was designed for surface readings, useless for penetrating 12 feet of stone and earth, but I had access to something better: Orbital Dynamics' complete archive of satellite data for the region. If the object beneath the chapel was generating heat, that heat had to go somewhere. And if I was right about what was down there, the heat generation might not be constant. I started with our company's historical scans of Axum, going back 15 years to when we first began regular coverage of the Horn of Africa. The early images showed the same thermal patterns I'd seen in the recent scan: solar absorption, geothermal activity, normal ground temperatures, but the void beneath the chapel was already 3 degrees warmer than its surroundings, even in the oldest images. 15 years of continuous heat generation. Whatever was down there wasn't running on batteries. I pulled up the metadata for each scan, looking for variations in the thermal signature over time. For the first few years, the readings were remarkably consistent. 3 degrees above ambient, no significant fluctuation. Then, starting in 2010, the pattern began to change. Small spikes at first, maybe half a degree increases that lasted for a few days before returning to baseline. But as I worked forward through the data, the spikes became more frequent and more intense. By 2018, I was seeing heat surges of 6 to 8 degrees above normal, sometimes lasting for weeks. The most recent scan, the one that had started this whole investigation, showed the highest readings yet. Nearly 12 degrees above the surrounding rock temperature, sustained over the 3-day period when the satellite had passed over the region. I sat back, staring at the data visualization on my screen. The heat signature wasn't just evidence that something was buried beneath the chapel. It was evidence that something was becoming more active, more powerful, more awake. But what could cause those kinds of fluctuations? I needed to correlate the thermal spikes with external events, see if there was a pattern I was missing. I opened a new browser window and started searching for news archives covering Ethiopia and the surrounding region. Wars, natural disasters, political upheavals, anything that might correspond to the dates when the thermal readings spiked. The first major heat spike had occurred in September 2010. I cross-referenced the date and found coverage of renewed fighting in South Sudan, just a few hundred miles from Axum. Border clashes, civilian casualties, the usual litany of African conflict. The heat signature had jumped to 6 degrees above normal and stayed there for 2 weeks. December 2014, another spike, this one lasting almost a month. I found reports of protests in Ethiopia's Oromia region that had turned violent, with government forces killing dozens of demonstrators. The thermal readings had peaked at 8 degrees above normal. March 2019, the biggest spike yet, nearly 10 degrees above ambient temperature. Major fighting had erupted between Ethiopia and Eritrea along their shared border, the worst violence in years between the two countries. Thousands of troops mobilized, artillery exchanges, threats of full-scale war. The pattern was undeniable. Every time conflict erupted in the region, the object beneath the chapel became more active. Not just reactive, but almost anticipatory. Some of the thermal spikes had begun days or even weeks before the first news reports of violence. I leaned back in the hotel room's uncomfortable chair, trying to process what the data was telling me. If the Ark of the Covenant was really buried beneath that chapel, and if it was somehow responding to regional conflicts, what did that mean? According to biblical accounts, the Ark had been a weapon, used by the Israelites to destroy their enemies and part the Jordan River. But those were just stories, weren't they? Ancient myths to explain natural phenomena or military victories. Except now I had 15 years of satellite data suggesting those stories might have been more literal than anyone imagined. I opened a new search window and typed in Ark of the Covenant Biblical Powers. The results were a mixture of scholarly articles, religious websites, and conspiracy theories, but certain themes appeared consistently. The Ark as a communication device between God and Moses. The Ark as a weapon capable of destroying armies. The Ark as a source of divine power that killed anyone who touched it improperly. One academic paper caught my attention. Electromagnetic Anomalies in Biblical Texts, a technical analysis of the Ark narrative. The author, a physicist from MIT, had attempted to explain the Ark's described effects in terms of advanced technology rather than divine intervention. According to his analysis, the biblical descriptions were consistent with some kind of high-energy, electromagnetic device, possibly using principles that modern science was only beginning to understand. The paper was 8 years old and had been largely ignored by mainstream academia, but its conclusions were fascinating. If the Ark contained technology rather than divine presence, technology based on electromagnetic manipulation of space-time, then its effects on local conflicts might be measurable, predictable, even controllable. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, but I wasn't tired. I had 15 years of data to analyse, patterns to uncover, connections to make. If I was right about what was happening, the implications went far beyond archaeological discovery. This was about a weapon that had been influencing regional conflicts for decades, maybe centuries, sitting 12 feet beneath a chapel in northern Ethiopia. A weapon that was becoming more active. I pulled up the most recent thermal readings again, studying the heat signature that had triggered this entire investigation. 12 degrees above ambient temperature, the highest reading yet. And according to the news feeds I'd been monitoring, tensions were rising again along the Ethiopia-Eritrea border. Troop movements, diplomatic protests, the same warning signs that had preceded every previous spike in the thermal data. If the pattern held, the heat signature beneath the chapel would spike again within days, and somewhere in the Horn of Africa, people would start dying. I saved all my analysis to an encrypted drive and uploaded backup copies to 3 different cloud storage services. Whatever was happening in Axum, I was probably the only person outside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church who understood the connection between the buried object and regional violence. The only person who could prove that the Ark of the Covenant wasn't just a religious relic, but an active weapon that had been shaping the history of East Africa for 3 millennia. The only person who might be able to stop it. I had a contact at the Vatican archives, someone I'd met at a conference on satellite archaeology 3 years earlier. Elena Rossi was a researcher specialising in the historical verification of biblical sites, and she had access to documents that most scholars could only dream of seeing. If anyone could tell me what the Catholic Church knew about the Ethiopian claims regarding the Ark, it would be her. I drafted a carefully worded email describing my satellite findings in technical terms, without mentioning my theories about the thermal correlations with regional conflicts. I presented it as an archaeological question. Had the Vatican ever investigated the Ethiopian Orthodox claims about possessing the Ark of the Covenant? Elena's response came within 6 hours, which surprised me. Her replies usually took days, given the bureaucratic nature of Vatican communications. Alex, your inquiry has been noted and forwarded to the appropriate department. However, I must inform you that materials related to your specific request are currently under protocol relic restrictions. I cannot provide further information at this time. I would advise against pursuing this research direction. E. Rossi, Protocol Relic. I'd never heard the term before, and a quick internet search turned up nothing. No academic papers, no government documents, no casual references in religious forums. It was as if the phrase existed in a completely separate information ecosystem, one that normal researchers couldn't access. That afternoon, my hotel room phone rang. The caller ID showed only international with no number. Mr. Morrison. The voice was American, middle-aged, with the kind of neutral accent that comes from years of diplomatic training. Yes, my name is Cardinal Michael Toretti, Vatican Secretariat of State. I understand you've been making inquiries about certain historical artifacts currently held by our Ethiopian Orthodox colleagues. A cardinal calling me directly. In 31 years of life, I'd never been important enough to warrant attention from anyone higher than a district manager, and now I had a Vatican cardinal on the line. I'm a satellite imaging technician, I said carefully. I analyse ground-penetrating radar for geological surveys. Yes, we're aware of your professional background. We're also aware of your recent travel to Axum and your communication with Dr. Rossi. Mr. Morrison, I'm calling to advise you that you've stumbled into an area of inquiry that falls under Vatican security protocols. For your own safety, I strongly recommend that you discontinue this research and return to the United States immediately. My own safety? There are historical artifacts that were never meant to be disturbed, Mr. Morrison. Some knowledge carries a price that few are prepared to pay. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained certain guardianship responsibilities for nearly 3 millennia. That arrangement exists for the protection of all concerned parties. I could feel my heart racing, but I tried to keep my voice steady. What is Protocol Relic? There was a long pause. You're not cleared for that information, nor do you want to be. Take my advice, Mr. Morrison. Book the next flight home and forget whatever you think you've discovered in Axum. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. The line went dead. I sat in my hotel room for a long time after that call, staring at the phone and trying to process what had just happened. A cardinal in the Vatican Secretariat of State, essentially the Catholic Church's Secretary of State, had called me personally to warn me away from my research. Not a local church official, not even a regional administrator, but someone at the very highest levels of Vatican hierarchy. Which meant the Catholic Church not only knew about the Ethiopian claims regarding the Ark, they were actively monitoring anyone who showed too much interest in investigating those claims. They had files on researchers, protocols for managing inquiries, and enough influence to track down a satellite technician in an Ethiopian hotel within hours of his asking the wrong questions. I thought about the Guardian's hollow eyes and his desperate warning, "You don't want what's inside." Maybe he wasn't just protecting the Ark from the world. Maybe he was protecting the world from the Ark. My laptop chimed with a new email notification. The sender was listed as E. Rossi, but the message was clearly not from Elena. "Mr. Morrison, this will be my final communication on this matter. Protocol Relic is a Vatican security classification established in 1962 following certain discoveries made during the Second Vatican Council's review of sealed archives. Materials under this classification are restricted to a maximum of 12 individuals worldwide, all of whom hold positions equivalent to cardinal or higher within the Catholic hierarchy. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained custody of the artifact in question under a formal agreement dating to 1965. This agreement recognises Ethiopian sovereignty over the artifact in exchange for adherence to specific containment protocols established by a joint Vatican-Ethiopian commission. These protocols exist because the artifact exhibits properties that pose significant risks to regional stability when improperly handled or exposed. The Guardian tradition is not merely ceremonial, it serves a crucial containment function that has prevented numerous potential catastrophes over the past several decades. Your thermal analysis data has been reviewed by our technical staff. We are aware of the correlations you have identified. We are also aware of the artifact's increasing activity levels over the past 5 years. A joint Vatican-Ethiopian assessment team is currently evaluating options for enhanced containment measures. This communication will self-delete in 60 seconds. Do not attempt to copy or save this message. Return to the United States immediately and discontinue all research related to this matter. You have been warned twice. There will not be a third warning. I watched the message count down from 60 seconds, trying to memorize every word. When it reached 0, the email disappeared from my inbox as if it had never existed. But I'd learned what I needed to know. The Vatican knew about the thermal correlations with regional conflicts. They'd known for years, possibly decades. And they were worried enough about increasing activity levels to consider enhanced containment measures. The Ark of the Covenant was real, it was buried beneath the chapel in Axum, and it was becoming more dangerous. I needed to get that thermal data to someone who could do something about it. Someone outside the Vatican's sphere of influence. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I opened my laptop and began typing up a detailed summary of everything I'd discovered. The satellite data, the thermal correlations with regional conflicts, the Vatican security protocols, the Guardian's warning. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be a record of what I'd found. Outside my hotel window, the ancient obelisks of Axum stood silhouetted against the Ethiopian night sky, monuments to a civilization that had claimed to possess God's greatest gift to humanity. 12 feet below, a simple stone chapel. Something waited in the darkness, growing stronger, growing more active, preparing for something that would make the regional conflicts of the past 15 years look like minor skirmishes. And I was probably the only person outside the Vatican and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church who understood what was coming. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of booking a flight home like the Vatican had demanded, I drove the rental car to a cybercafe in Addis Ababa and uploaded a carefully edited version of my satellite data to Reddit. I chose the r/conspiracy subreddit because I knew it would get attention without being taken seriously by any official monitoring systems. The post was titled Weird thermal anomaly under Ethiopian church. Anyone know what this could be? I included 3 of the clearer thermal images showing the heat signature beneath the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, along with GPS coordinates and a brief description of the geometric void. I deliberately left out any mention of the Ark, the Vatican communications, or the correlations with regional conflicts. To casual readers, it would look like a curious geological anomaly discovered by a satellite technician who was genuinely puzzled by what he'd found. The post got 17 comments in the first hour. Most were jokes about ancient aliens or government cover-ups, but a few showed genuine technical interest. One user with apparent geology credentials suggested underground geothermal activity. Another pointed out that the heat signature was too localized and too geometric to be natural. I was reading through the comments when my laptop screen went black. Not a normal shutdown or crash, but an instantaneous cut-off as if someone had yanked the power cord. Except the laptop was running on battery power and the charging light was still on. The screen stayed black for maybe 10 seconds, then flickered back to life showing the Windows startup sequence. When the system finished rebooting, my Reddit post was gone. Not deleted with a moderator message, not removed for violating community guidelines, but completely absent as if it had never existed. My browser history showed no record of visiting Reddit. The thermal images I'd uploaded weren't in my recent files folder. Someone had remotely accessed my laptop and scrubbed all evidence of the post, while leaving everything else untouched. I sat in the internet cafe for a long time, watching Ethiopian families use the other computers to video chat with relatives abroad and university students researching papers. Normal people living normal lives, oblivious to the fact that I'd just learned something terrifying about the reach and capabilities of whoever was monitoring research into the Axum artifact. They had hacked my laptop remotely, selectively deleted specific files, and removed all trace of my Reddit post within hours of its publication. This wasn't just Vatican influence or church pressure. This was signals intelligence, cyber warfare capabilities, the kind of resources that only major governments or international intelligence agencies could deploy. I paid for my computer time and walked back to the rental car, feeling like I was being watched even though the street looked perfectly normal. Addis Ababa traffic flowed around me with its usual chaotic energy. Buses packed with passengers, merchants pushing handcarts loaded with goods, children selling bottled water at red lights. But someone in that crowd could be monitoring me. Someone with access to satellite feeds and facial recognition software, and the authority to scrub information from major social media platforms in real time. That night, back in my hotel room in Axum, I made backup copies of all my remaining data and hid them in 3 different locations around the town. One encrypted drive taped under a restaurant table where I'd eaten dinner, another hidden in the base of an ancient obelisk in the archaeological park, the third buried in a plastic bag near a tree outside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, as close to the chapel as I could get without being seen. If they could hack my devices remotely, I needed analog backups they couldn't access digitally. The next morning I woke to find my hotel room door unlocked. I always use the deadbolt and chain lock, habits from years of business travel. But both were disengaged, and there was no sign of forced entry. My luggage had been searched with professional thoroughness. Everything returned to almost exactly its original position, but with tiny variations that proved someone had been through my belongings. My laptop was still there, apparently untouched. My cameras and field equipment were undisturbed, but the encrypted drive where I'd stored copies of the satellite data was missing from the hidden compartment in my suitcase. They'd taken only what they needed and left everything else to maintain the illusion that nothing had happened. Except they'd made one mistake. They'd unlocked the door when they left, probably to avoid the sound of manipulating the locks from inside. I was no longer just being monitored, I was being actively managed. I packed quickly and checked out of the hotel, telling the desk clerk I had a family emergency back in the United States. But instead of heading to the airport, I drove to the archaeological park and retrieved the data drive I'd hidden at the base of the obelisk. Sitting in the rental car with ancient stone monuments all around me, I made one final attempt to get the information out. I logged into an anonymous email account I'd created years earlier and composed a message to every major news organisation I could think of: CNN, BBC, Reuters, AP, the New York Times. The subject line was simple: evidence of active electromagnetic anomaly at claimed Ark of Covenant site in Ethiopia. In the body of the message I laid out everything: the satellite thermal data, the correlations with regional conflicts, the Vatican's protocol relic warnings, the cyber intrusion and hotel room search. I attached the clearest thermal images and GPS coordinates, along with a detailed timeline showing how the heat signature had intensified over 15 years. I hit send and watched the message appear in my outbox, then immediately start moving to the sent folder. Except it never arrived. I tried again with a different email service, then a third. Same result every time. The messages showed as sent from my end, but never reached their destinations. Someone was intercepting my communications at the internet service provider level, identifying and blocking any transmission that contained my satellite data or references to the Axum thermal anomaly. I was completely isolated, cut off from any normal channels of communication, surrounded by an electronic net that prevented me from sharing what I'd discovered. But I still had the physical drive hidden near the church, and I still had one option they couldn't control remotely. That afternoon, I walked to the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion compound, and found a spot where I could observe the restricted chapel from a distance. Tourists and pilgrims moved through the public areas, taking photos and buying souvenirs, while the Guardian's building sat silent and forbidden behind its fence. I waited until late afternoon, when the crowds thinned and the light was beginning to fade. Then I walked casually toward the area where I'd buried the encrypted drive, as if I were just another tourist admiring the ancient architecture. The drive was gone. The plastic bag was still there, exactly where I'd buried it, but empty. They'd found my backup, extracted the data, and left the bag as a message. We know where you've been. We know what you've hidden. We can reach anything you think is secure. As I stood there staring at the empty bag, a shadow fell across the ground beside me. I looked up to see the Guardian standing at one of the chapel windows, his hollow eyes fixed on my face. But this time, he wasn't warning me away. He was nodding, almost imperceptibly, as if he approved of what I'd been trying to do. Then he pointed downward, toward the ground beneath my feet, and mouthed a single word I could read clearly even at 50 yards distance. Soon! I flew back to the United States the next day, but I never made it to my apartment in Denver. 2 men in dark suits were waiting for me at baggage claim, holding a sign with my name and looking like the kind of federal agents you see in movies. "Mr. Morrison, we're with the Department of Homeland Security. We need to speak with you about your recent travel activities." They escorted me to a windowless room in the airport's security section, where a third man was waiting with a thick folder and a digital recorder. "I'm Agent Phillips," the older man said. "We understand you've been conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering in Ethiopia, specifically related to sites of religious significance to our Ethiopian government partners. I'm a satellite imaging technician. I analyze geological data for mining and construction companies. We're aware of your professional background, Mr. Morrison. We're also aware that you've been making inquiries about classified materials with Vatican contacts, posting sensitive imagery to social media platforms, and attempting to contact media organizations with what you claim is evidence of electromagnetic anomalies at Ethiopian Orthodox Church sites. They knew everything. Not just my activities in Ethiopia, but my attempts to share the data, my communications with Elena Rossi, even my failed Reddit post. The thermal imagery you captured falls under the jurisdiction of several international agreements regarding the protection of cultural and religious sites," Phillips continued. "Specifically, it relates to a joint Vatican-Ethiopian cultural preservation protocol that supersedes normal academic or journalistic access. Cultural preservation protocol? The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has requested that certain sites be protected from unauthorized analysis or exposure that might damage their religious significance or cultural integrity. The Vatican has agreed to help enforce these protections as part of ongoing interfaith cooperation initiatives. It was a lie, of course. They weren't protecting cultural sites. They were suppressing evidence of something that posed a much more serious threat. but I was sitting in a windowless room at the Denver airport with 3 federal agents, and my laptop had already demonstrated that normal channels of communication were compromised. "We're prepared to offer you a choice, Mr. Morrison," Philip said. "You can sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding your recent research activities, accept reassignment to a different geographical focus area within your company, and continue your career with no further complications. Or we can discuss this matter with your employer, your security clearance sponsors, and potentially with federal prosecutors, who take a very dim view of unauthorized intelligence activities in sensitive foreign locations." I stared at the folder on the table between us, thinking about the Guardian's hollow eyes and his final gesture toward the ground beneath the chapel. Thinking about 15 years of thermal data showing an ancient weapon growing stronger, more active, more dangerous. What happens if I sign? You return to your normal work assignments. You avoid any further research related to Ethiopian archaeological sites. You don't discuss your recent findings with colleagues, media contacts, or internet forums. In exchange, we ensure that your employer receives a positive assessment of your professionalism and discretion during this culturally sensitive assignment. And if I don't sign? Phillips opened the folder and showed me the first page. It was a letter from Orbital Dynamics' Human Resources Department, dated that morning, informing me that my employment had been terminated due to misuse of company resources for unauthorized personal research projects. "Your security clearance will be revoked," he continued. "Your access to government contracting databases will be permanently blocked, and we'll be sharing our assessment of your activities with other satellite imaging companies, geological survey firms, and any future employers who request background information." They were offering to destroy my career or let me pretend none of this had ever happened, but either way, the information I'd gathered would never reach anyone who could act on it. I thought about Cardinal Toretti's warning on the phone. Some knowledge carries a price that few are prepared to pay. Maybe this was the price. Professional destruction, isolation, the slow erasure of everything I'd worked to build over the past decade. I need time to think about it. "You have until we finish processing your luggage, 20 minutes, maybe 30. 20 minutes to decide whether to sacrifice my career for information that no one would believe, no one could verify, and no one was allowed to investigate." I signed the non-disclosure agreement. They released me 2 hours later with a stern warning about the consequences of violating federal agreements, and a business card with a phone number I could call if I ever felt tempted to discuss my Ethiopian research with anyone. But they made one crucial mistake. They assumed I was the only person who had access to the satellite data. That night in my apartment in Denver, I opened my laptop and logged into Orbital Dynamics employee portal. My access had been suspended, as expected, but the system showed I was still listed as being on authorized leave for another 3 days. Someone had delayed updating my termination in the central database. I used those 3 days to access everything I could reach. Not just my own analysis files, but the complete archive of satellite coverage for the Horn of Africa going back to the company's founding. If the thermal anomaly beneath the Axum Chapel was increasing in intensity, there might be other sites showing similar patterns, other locations where ancient artifacts were responding to modern conflicts. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The Ark wasn't unique, it was part of a network. Thermal anomalies appeared at 17 different locations across the Middle East and North Africa, all buried beneath religious sites, all generating heat signatures that correlated with regional violence. A geometric void beneath the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Another under the Great Mosque of Mecca. Heat sources beneath Christian monasteries in Syria, Coptic churches in Egypt, ancient temples in Iraq. Every major conflict of the past 2 decades, the Iraq War, the Syrian Civil War, the Arab Spring, the ongoing violence in Yemen and Libya, correlated with intensified thermal activity at multiple sites, as if the artifacts were communicating with each other, coordinating their responses to human warfare. I copied everything I could access onto encrypted drives and mailed them to safety deposit boxes in 3 different states. Then I submitted my resignation from Orbital Dynamics, citing personal reasons, and disappeared. For 3 weeks I lived in cheap motels and paid for everything with cash, moving from city to city while I tried to figure out what to do with what I'd learned. The thermal network wasn't just evidence of ancient technology, it was evidence of an active weapons system that had been influencing human conflict for millennia. A weapons system that was becoming more coordinated, more responsive, more powerful. On a Tuesday morning in Salt Lake City, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Elena Rossi. "Alex, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for weeks." "Elena, I thought you were under Vatican restrictions." "I'm calling from a secure line. Listen carefully. Something has happened. The Ethiopian government has sealed off the entire Axum region. No flights in or out, no ground access, complete media blackout. They're claiming it's a military exercise, but my sources inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church say it's something else." "What kind of something else?" "The Guardian is dead, Alex. He died 3 days ago. And when they went to choose his replacement, they found the chapel empty. Whatever was buried beneath the church, it's gone." I felt the blood drain from my face. Gone how? No one knows. The Ethiopian military is conducting a grid search of the entire region, but there's no sign of forced entry, no evidence of excavation, no indication that anyone broke into the chapel. The artifact simply left. That's impossible. Satellite thermal imaging shows massive energy spikes at 17 locations across the Middle East and North Africa, all occurring within a 6-hour window starting with the Guardian's death. The Vatican has activated something called the Omega Protocol, and they're requesting immediate assistance from the United States, Russia and China. The Omega Protocol. I'd never heard the term before, but I could guess what it meant. The final contingency, the last resort when all other containment measures had failed. "Eleanor, where are you calling from?" "I'm at a monastery in Switzerland. The Vatican has evacuated all protocol relic personnel to secure locations. They're expecting the worst." "What's the worst?" "According to the sealed archives, the last time the artifacts were fully active was during the Crusades. The entire geopolitical structure of 3 continents collapsed within a century. Empires fell, entire populations migrated, technological development stalled for 500 years. I thought about the thermal data I'd collected, the correlations between artifact activity and regional violence. If the Ark and its companion devices were no longer contained, no longer isolated in buried chambers beneath ancient churches, what would happen to the world?" "Alex, are you still there?" "Yeah." "Eleanor, I need you to do something. I'm going to send you coordinates for safety deposit boxes in Phoenix, Dallas and Atlanta. Inside each box is a complete archive of satellite data showing the thermal network. If something happens to me, make sure that information reaches someone who can act on it." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to find the Ark." The line went dead. That afternoon I bought a plane ticket to Ethiopia under a false name, using identity documents I'd acquired during my weeks of hiding. If the Ethiopian government had sealed off the Axum region, I'd have to find another way in, but I was probably the only person outside government and religious authorities who understood the scope of what was happening. The only person who might be able to track down a 3,000-year-old weapon that had just escaped from its prison and was preparing to reshape human civilization. I'm writing this from a cabin in the mountains of western Montana, 6 months after the Axum incident. The official story is that a localized seismic event damaged several ancient structures in northern Ethiopia, requiring temporary military restrictions while archaeological assessment teams evaluate the cultural heritage impact. The real story is that 17 ancient weapons have vanished from their containment sites across 3 continents, leaving behind nothing but empty chambers and the withered corpses of their guardians. The thermal network I discovered through satellite analysis was just the visible symptom of something much older and more complex. For 3 millennia, objects of immense power had been sleeping beneath humanity's most sacred sites, occasionally stirring in response to nearby conflicts, but generally remaining dormant under the watch of religious orders that had forgotten why they were really guarding empty rooms. Now they're awake, active and loose in a world with 7 billion people, and enough weapons to destroy civilization a dozen times over. Elena kept her promise and distributed copies of my satellite archive to researchers at major universities, intelligence agencies and international organizations. Most dismissed the data as elaborate hoax or misinterpreted sensor readings. A few took it seriously enough to begin their own investigations, only to discover that every relevant database had been scrubbed, every supporting document had vanished, every potential witness had signed binding non-disclosure agreements. But I know the truth is spreading, filtering through the kind of networks that governments can't completely control. Academic conferences where researchers share suspicions in private conversations. Intelligence analysts who notice patterns their superiors don't want them to report. Military officers who track unexplained energy signatures and find their requests for investigation quietly denied. The world is changing, and most people don't realise it yet. Regional conflicts that should burn out quickly are intensifying instead. Ancient ethnic tensions are flaring into violence across Africa and the Middle East. Political movements that seemed stable are fracturing along religious lines. The artifacts aren't causing the conflicts. Humans are perfectly capable of finding reasons to fight each other, but they're amplifying existing tensions, feeding on the emotional energy of warfare and using that power to grow stronger, more coordinated, more influential. I've been tracking their movements through news reports, social media posts, and amateur satellite imagery, shared on forums that haven't been scrubbed yet. Heat signatures appearing in conflict zones days before major battles. Unexplained electromagnetic anomalies detected near military bases. Reports of ancient artifacts being discovered by various armed groups, then quickly disappearing again. They're not random. They're following a pattern, positioning themselves to influence key events, preparing for something bigger than individual regional conflicts. Last week I received an encrypted message through a routing system so complex I couldn't trace its origin. The text was simple. The Covenant was not meant for one people or one place. It was meant for all people, all places when the time was ready. The time is now ready. Choose wisely. Choose wisely, as if I have a choice in whatever's coming. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the real power of these artifacts isn't their ability to influence events, but their ability to force people to make choices they wouldn't otherwise have to make. The Guardian in Axum spent decades watching over something that was slowly killing him, but he chose to stay, chose to maintain the containment protocols, chose to warn me away from dangers I didn't understand. Now it's my turn to choose. I could destroy this account, burn the remaining evidence, disappear completely into a life where none of this ever happened. Or I can keep tracking the artifacts, documenting their movements, building a record of what's really happening as the world stumbles towards some kind of transformation it doesn't see coming. The cabin where I'm staying sits on 40 acres of isolated mountain forest, far from cities and conflict zones, and the electromagnetic networks that seem to attract the artifact's attention. But even here, on clear nights, I can see strange lights moving across the sky. Not aircraft, not satellites, but something else entirely, following patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose. They're out there, 17 pieces of ancient technology that were designed to reshape civilizations, and they're working together now, coordinating their efforts, preparing for something that will make the fall of empires look like minor historical footnotes. I have 3 more encrypted drives hidden in various locations around the country, each containing copies of everything I've learned about the thermal network and the artifact sites. If you're reading this, it means something happened to me, and Elena Rossi or one of the other researchers I contacted managed to get this information published despite whatever security measures are in place to prevent it. Don't dismiss this as conspiracy theory or elaborate fiction. Check the satellite data yourself if you have access. Look for thermal anomalies beneath major religious sites. Track the correlations between unexplained energy signatures and regional conflicts. Pay attention to news reports of ancient artifacts being discovered and then quickly classified or removed by authorities. The pattern is there if you know how to look for it. The Ark of the Covenant was never lost. It was never just sitting passively in some forgotten chamber, waiting to be discovered by archaeologists or treasure hunters. It was sleeping, along with its companion devices, under the protection of guardians who understood that some powers are too dangerous for humanity to wield. Now it's awake, and it's not alone, and it's preparing to fulfill whatever purpose it was originally designed for 3,000 years ago. The only question is whether we'll be ready for what comes next. And I hope this account reaches people who can do something with the information, people with resources and influence, and the courage to investigate what most would rather ignore. But even if it doesn't, even if this becomes just another conspiracy theory lost in the noise of the internet, at least there will be a record of what one satellite technician discovered when he looked too closely at the wrong thermal signature. The Ark Protocol is active, the Covenant has been renewed, and somewhere in the darkness between the ancient and the modern, 17 pieces of divine technology are preparing to reshape the world according to plans that were set in motion before human civilization began. Choose wisely. Alex Morrison, December 2024.